Actually, Phil had a little bit of a question about, do you remember Kenneth Smith's essay about wholesale ethics, retail ethics,
Yes.
where he talks about Christianity, capitalism, and science?
Yes.
What was your question, Phil? It was about, do you think capitalism is the only thing that's important in politics or something like that? I forgot your exact question, but
Well, I think my question was, do you think, 'cause he named the three things, right? And I thought, well, maybe politics is important. So I asked, like, has politics been subsumed by capitalism? In other
uh,
words, so
Yes.
really, yeah,
Yes, it
yeah,
has, and it has to such a point that you don't have to be a Marxist or a theorist or a philosopher to see it now. It's like everybody is noticing that literally everything has been reduced to money and who can buy what. Even politics, they buy politicians and buy federal agencies as they want to if they've got the money to do it.
sure, I agree. And you know, I'm not, well, actually, I am down capitalism, but I'm certainly down with the kind of capitalism we have now, which is so extreme, right?
And it also follows into the lobbyists,
Yes.
after you have held power, then you become a lobbyist. And there you go. The money cycle continues.
Yeah, when I started working in the VA in 1984, there were revolving door laws that said you couldn't go from a position of power in government directly to industry and sell out all of the secrets and things that you had done. Nor could you, while you were in office, retailer a government agency to suit a corporation and then go join that corporation and reap enormous rewards. But now you can. All those laws have been changed. They
Yeah.
they have these sort of pro forma things that say, oh, for 2 years you can't do business with the agency that you left. But what these corporations do is they just firewall off a separate part of their corporation. That's the nest that you land in for 2 years. And when the 2 years are over, you come back into the main organization and sell things directly back to the agency that you just retooled.
Well,
I know people who did this.
for today, it's almost as if you have those restrictions. That's un-American, right?
Right.
In a way, right?
Right. So
Why
many.
shouldn't you, like, even when you're in office, why shouldn't you, you know, get the gain? Because that's part of the reason why you went into office.
Yeah, it's so many things that are important to life and sanity and health seem to be un-American these days. But
Yeah,
that's
I was just going to say, what is American?
it's become a much longer conversation. Today
Right.
we have a much more specific and difficult question that we're exploring,
Yeah.
which is we're going to examine Kenneth Smith's use of the terminology yin and yang in this chapter of Mythic Desperation, and then we're going to go back to original sources and see what did the Chinese have to say about yin and yang in various works, and to what extent are we actually is he capturing that accurately? To what extent might it be a pop culture abstraction of it? It's always ironic when somebody who's opposed to Verstand drifts into Verstand himself in the process of criticizing Verstand. It does happen, but also we'll also look to see, how much does he get right about it? Where do they really align well? And in preparation for this, I did some remedial reading and philosophizing that I should have done like 40 years ago, and was hauling out copies of the I Ching and the Huinanzi and
40 years ago.
Dao De Jing. Oh, I first got into philosophy as a teenager, and I was crazy for yin and yang and for Zen and for all these things. And yet I only read a handful of sources. And a lot of the sources were written by white people. It's like, what's wrong with this picture? I want to know what the Chinese think. Well, I should certainly not ask the Chinese. I should go ask this German guy or this American, guy. It's like this is not a good way to get to the authentic philosophy and find out what people really thought. And so over and over every day this week, I've just been had my head exploded going, oh my God, you mean that book never actually says those words? Or, I thought this was the source for that, but it's not. And who's this other guy? He's the guy who invented the yin and yang symbol. So late? It's all just surprise after surprise after surprise all week. So I'm coming into this really excited and full of a reminder of my own limits and liabilities as a student and a philosopher. I discovered also that Meetup has all kinds of severe limits about how much and how often you can post. So I was constantly trying to post links to things. It was like, no, that's too long. And shrink it
Yeah,
down
I
to
was
like
gonna
10
mention
letters.
that.
And it's like, no, it's still too long. And I'm like, okay, that's not the real problem. I've just been saying too much there. I get it. But now you're all at my mercy. I can start sharing references and links to books, and I'm gonna make hefty use of that chat part of the window over there. In fact, I'm gonna start right now. I'm gonna point us to
Can
a
we
book.
get a copy of the chat? Or whatever window you're going to use.
I don't know if is it David? Is
Yeah.
it carried along with the recordings?
Hey, what now?
The chat section of the Zoom.
You can save the chat. You click on the 3 dots. It gives you the option to save a chat in a Zoom.
Click on the
call.
3 dots. Where are the 3 dots?
Next at the bottom near where you type, you see
Where it
there's one
says
that says
Oh,
to
yes,
everyone, and there's
yes,
file, and then there's 3 dots.
yes. Oh yeah.
There
Says
is
It
copy
saves a
paste.
snapshot like right now, so it'll only have like the first few minutes.
Right.
So usually, like I try to remember to save it at the end.
That's what we want to do. Is right before people
Yeah.
leave, each person should say, "Okay, now's my chance."
But I think the hosts also can like set up. Correct me if I'm wrong, David. Like when you set up the meeting as a host, you can have it auto save the chat, or is that just the cloud recording only? I can't remember.
I think on a certain level, if you're paying for a certain level of Zoom, they will do that automatically. Okay. But I have to double check on that. I don't know. I'll check.
Yeah, but usually best just to kind of like either just remember or set yourself reminders, save at the end.
So let's
Okay.
start with this book right here. The ebook, the Kindle version, is only $15, which is a steal because some of the other amazing references I found this week have ridiculously expensive. even on Kindle, they're like $80, and I'm like, are you kidding me for a Kindle? But this is $15. It's called A Short History of Chinese Philosophy. I didn't find it until the day before yesterday after spending a whole week looking for good references. It's by Feng Lan. And he is one of the preeminent scholars of Chinese philosophy. This is his abridged version. He abridged it himself with the help of a good friend of his who is an editor. And so what they did, it's not like a Bowdlerized version. What they did is they just excluded, minor philosophers and then tightened in their focus on the major philosophers. So they're still able to cover the entire history of Chinese philosophy and all kinds of major periods in it, but they do it swiftly. It's like, this is a book that chapter by chapter gets to the point and tells you the amazing, exciting things about each development, and who did they argue with, and who didn't like them, and what were the core parts of their tenets. So it's that kind of, there are philosophy books that you struggle through because they're so dense, and there's philosophy books that you struggle through because there's so many words and it's not dense and you have to struggle to find the point. This is one of those delightful little books that's both concise and
Here.
rich, chewy. Hey, Richard, you got your hand up. What's up?
Yeah, so I'll admit to, sometimes looking at videos of from the School of Life on YouTube just to kind of get a quick overview, but just, keeping in mind that, like all writers, all creators are going to have a certain viewpoint or bias potentially. But one thing that was kind of striking is that anytime they discuss Eastern philosophy, I mean, not only, is there going to be coming at it from a certain angle, but they really race through it in terms of just narrating. It's so fast. It's like, there are like other comments on that. So it was kind of funny, I thought.
Well, and what's great about Feng Yulan is that this is his shortened version of his much, much longer, more complete work. So if you read this and you find things in it that you love, and if you like his style, you can always shell out for the much bigger work that really covers the ground in great detail. It's so... you could sort of decide how far you want to go.
Thanks. I'll take a look at that reference.
It took me forever to find him. and part of it turns out there's a reason it took me forever to find him. Throughout the 20th century, China had a lot of struggles about its relationship to its own history of philosophy. It went through a number of different ideological periods where it had different, very strong feelings about what you should and shouldn't be talking about. And so this is one of the people who was consistent across the time about trying to really not let the ideological shifts one way or the other change his fundamental interest in.
And like
Chinese
the most
philosophy.
recent major one, like the Cultural Revolution, was not that long ago, and and many have commented on how it's been such a violent, cutting from the past, from its past. It can, and basically, in terms of at least economically adopting so many things from the Western model, right?
That's right.
Capitalist industrialist economies. Yeah.
That's right. So what's fascinating about Feng Yulan is that he got into Chinese philosophy before the Cultural Revolution. He wrote books before the Cultural Revolution. He wrote books during the Cultural Revolution, and then now he's, he's passed away now, I think. But he managed to put out some more books after the Cultural Revolution to kind of create this kind of big epic span of time of perspectives on philosophy from different angles. Which, of course, what are we about, right? We're looking at these things from different angles. So.
Was he in China during the Cultural Revolution? I mean, in China, not in Hong Kong or Taiwan. I mean, because it seems to me he might have had problems being in there.
He did have problems. Yes, he did. Let me share with you the link to his page. He's got an interesting life story, and there it is on Wikipedia. It's not a bad article, and that's right. He passed away in 1990.
In Beijing, just a year after the Tiananmen massacre.
Yeah. So it's a way to kind of get an overview of the subject matter. I didn't start out with Feng Yulan. I only found him 2 days ago. Before that, I was looking for primary source materials based on things I already knew about and things that I have, but also things that I don't have, but knew I should have had years ago and have been feeling guilty about for decades not having. And I'm like, okay, today's seminar is my opportunity to go, make up some remedial ground and read some things I should have read. And well, in preparation for today, I have a little pile of books here. These are some of my things on Chinese or Eastern philosophy that are relative to this. But I'm still nowhere near as deep into this as I should be to play the role I'm going to try to play on today's call. So once again, I will remind people that I'm a student, not a professor. There's plenty of things I don't know here, and I'm going to get some stuff wrong. Since the section of the essay is so short, why don't we start with the essay text itself and talk a little bit about what he has to say here. And then after that, we can expand outwards to the primary source materials and compare them to the way he uses the terms and see what we think. Is that acceptable to everybody?
Sure.
Okay. So I will pull up my copy, which I should have had open already. Here we go. And for those who don't know, Mythos and Logos is a book that David and I are putting together out of writings by Kenneth Smith. Those writings previously took the form of essays and emails. He ran an email thread for a long time with philosophy students where they would pitch him questions and comments, and then he'd write basically essays or in some cases books in response to their questions. And we've been on that mailing list forever. And so, David did a great job of selecting some provocative essays on the subject of mythos culture versus logos culture, and how are they different? How are the two modes of mind behind mythos culture and logos culture that we're all born with? How are they different from each other, and how do they relate to each other? And how do we explain these difficult subjects when our own language doesn't give us the words we need to make these distinctions? So he brings in German, he brings in Greek, he brings in Chinese. He makes off references here and there to Hindu philosophy. He's doing what he can to try to triangulate on what's in our culture, a big lacuna, a big empty spot where we can't say some of the most fundamental things about how we think. English just doesn't have the words for it. For all the words for thinking that we have, none of them is about this fundamental distinction that Hegel and Heraclitus and Kierkegaard and others are writing about. So we are in the fourth essay in that section, in that book, I'm sorry. It's called Mythic Desperation, and it's a response he wrote to an email. And in it, he tries to talk about the mythic perspective, what mythos is, not from the perspective of moderns who think that myths are lies, maybe compelling lies, but from the perspective of the ancient Greeks or other ancient cultures or archaic cultures, particularly, for whom myths were something completely different, something vital and essential to sanity and health and culture.
This idea of myth, does it relate to Jung's notions of mythology and archetypes and so forth?
Yeah, there's a relationship. It's not an equation, but there's a relationship.
Okay.
Jung is another one of these writers who has a very strong flavor to his worldview, and all of the things that he incorporates are turned to orient themselves into that large system. And when Kenneth writes about these things, he's not writing about them in Jungian terms. So there's overlaps, but they're going to have different angles on the same subject matter, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You know, another person, intellectual, who was, promoting this idea of myth has been Jordan Peterson. And, in some of the meetups about Jordan Peterson, they're kind of like, exploring these ideas of myth, but they settled on the notion that what it leads to is a kind of religious understanding.
Yes.
And they settled on that as a kind of answer or key, as opposed to philosophy or, and I had a discussion with the guy who was talking about this, the main person who was on that meetup, and he was defending religion as the final answer to the questions that he was, that's being posed. Jordan Peterson and so forth. That you need to, in order to deal with this chaos, and that's how the people in the past, dealt with chaos, is to create these mythologies of organizing society, because there was this chaos represented by the dragons and so forth, that that people had to, find solace in these mythologies.
I would say that Ken Smith probably goes a little bit further than in elevating the importance of myth, because for him, rather than making sense of chaos, it seems to be almost a necessary ingredient in the formula of life. And so without it, you're pushed into this hyper-logos culture that we've been talking about all these weeks and has all these shortfalls. So I've never heard anyone elevate myth to the level that Kenneth Smith does, where it's a necessary component.
I don't know if anybody has read Steiner, but
yes, I have.
Can you type the name in the chat?
I'm sorry?
Rudolf Steiner.
Oh, Rudolf Steiner.
Rudolf Steiner. He taught, his pedagogy is very much based on myth. And what I've noticed with the education of both my children is if you don't start with myth and you start with fact and quote unquote history, you just cut out this whole creative, imaginative landscape that they live in for those first 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, and versus if you tell them myths, they're like stories. They're like, Grimm's fairy tales. There's, I'm forgetting the word, but they can make of it, they're interpreting it and growing on it, or, getting all the archetypes out of it, which is very, very different from, and that gives them a very different point of view on observation. So when you're observing, as in you start on physics, the first part is just observing what is happening. So that observation part includes so much, like freedom from set boundaries. And that's one thing that I feel like myths offer way before any historical or factual information will to the mindscape.
Yes. That's
She doesn't mean that theoretically. She means that very literally.
Yes.
In terms of the way the Waldorf schools are structured, is that they are built around mythology for the first elementary school into up to 7th grade.
Yeah, it is very literally. They only do, like, they start from the Old Testament, they do the Norse tales, they do every year. They follow through to like the old myths of Egypt, of India, and then the children are just taking those stories in without any quote unquote real reference to what we call history.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Phil.
First of all, I'm an artist. I'm interested in philosophy, but I'm an artist.
So is Kenneth Smith.
I know quite a bit about like all of the arts, but it seems to me like is it going to be like difficult, impossible to recuperate mythology in this sense? Because it seems to me like the 19th century poets made a valiant try to, in a sense, synthesize that with philosophy. And certainly somebody like, like the musician, like Beethoven, I mean, it wasn't like in a verbal sense, but in a kind of emotional sense, captured that. But by the 20th century, with logical positivism and all that, it just seems like it's been reduced to such a thing that even nowadays, poetry is a fledgling discipline at best, I mean, like it used to be a very powerful force. So if philosophy is like primarily, at least in the Western tradition, lost this mythic underlying support, and even poetry is like kind of ignored, like what is in its place to recapture it? Possibly religion, but religion has been in some way disqualified because it's been abused. So how do you propose we get out of this? Because I certainly believe that a mythic part is part of who we are as individuals and culture.
So I'd like to offer a short answer from Kenneth Smith from this book that Sharon quoted for us a couple of weeks ago. And it's stuck with me ever since. She, for those of you who don't know Sharon, she will tell you that she's not a philosopher and doesn't know much about philosophy. And then she will quote the most penetrating, potent lines from the essay under discussion and say, now that's interesting to me. And we all go, well, damn, that's the whole show right there. For someone who's not a philosopher, you strike right to the heart of philosophy. So I'm going to quote something that she quoted a few weeks ago because it directly answers what you're saying. I think you could decide for yourself. Mm-hmm. This is Kenneth Smith's terms. He says, mind abstracted from nature is an onanistic spectator. It becomes mere intellect, mere consciousness, no longer overrich and charged with nature's fecundity. Mind abstracted becomes a voyeur, abstractly gratified. Even when it forces nature into the Procrustean bed of controllable laboratory conditions, still it is only abstracta that will be extorted from the evidence, quantitative data, the geometric profile of their concordance. We do not know what it is like to live in a world that can be loved and wondered at the way mythic reality can, a world in which mysticism and experience have not grown divorced, as they have for moderns. Never again since the age of myth have human beings been so utterly at home in the world. It was the honeymoon of civilization. And I think what that speaks to is that we struggle in this modern apoetic, amythic age to feel real, to feel connected to each other, to feel connected to the world. We feel cut off. We suffer from imposter syndrome. We suffer from this great aching emptiness inside us where, for a while we can distract ourselves with the latest consumer novelties, but that wears off after a while and we're left wondering, what are we doing that's meaningful? How are we part of the larger picture? How are we contributing to one another and to the world? And in a mythic culture, a mythos culture, which is what he's writing about in this book, that's not a problem that they have. They have plenty of other problems, but that's not one of them. In our culture, there are many problems that we've solved that mythic cultures didn't solve, but we can't seem to solve this one right at the core about how to make ourselves feel at home and like life is worth living, which is why our suicide rate is so high.
Yeah, excuse me. I would like to share two things with you. I mean,
please.
First of all, let me give you my website. You'll get a good look of what my art is about.
Yeah. Drop that in the chat, please.
Well, How do I do? I don't even know how to do the chat. So
this should be if
if
you
you
take
drop it off, I'll just spell it out so it's easy.
okay, and I'll type it.
Okay, Phil Chan, no, art.com. You should come right to it.
Okay, let me navigate there.
And the other thing I would like to share with you is somehow send you an essay I wrote about maybe 3-4 years ago called "The Mystery of the Sand."
Yes.
It really deals with the relationship, in a sense, not necessarily myth, but certainly mystery, in relationship to contemporary particle physics.
Yes.
And it's I think it's worth reading.
I would love to.
So how would I send it to you?
Well,
I mean, because I think the website, I think that's too long. It's about 4 pages long, so I can't include it all in there, you know.
The best thing for you to do is just save it on a Google Drive, and then you can invite people to look at it on your drive. Maybe you could, maybe after the meetup ends, you could talk to some people about how to do that.
Could I just send it to one of you or something, and you guys know how to deal with it? I don't mind, you know, like you see it.
You could send it to David Roel, who the organizer, and then he could put a link to it in these invites to the meetups.
Okay. I just wanted to add.
Sorry.
I just wanted to add directly to Phil's question about what can be done for myth to regain its rightful place. You know, that's actually the exact topic of our reading this week, the yin and the yang.
It is.
And on page 53 at the top, I was very heartened by Kenneth Smith saying that yang actually, yang is the logical culture, the hyper masculine, the forcefulness, just for people who didn't do the reading. And he says that it's inherently self-destructive. It inherently sows the seeds for its own destruction. And so, you know, if you're wondering whether there's ever going to be a time for art to regain its rightful place, if you're sort of subscribed to his vision here, you can see that in his writing, he believes that it definitely will and must, that you can't have yin without yang. You can't have logic without myth. And maybe the pendulum has swung, but according to, I think, Ken Smith's worldview, it must swing back for there to be any balance, or else, you know, the whole system just sort of falls apart and we're in a Mad Max type of a situation.
Right.
So yeah, in the reading, you can be heartened by yang sowing the seeds for its own destruction.
Be very sensitive to the name Yang, because my last name is Yang. No, I'm just
Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Professor Marshall. And thank you, David Roel, for sending the link. I've been giving David a hard time because I've been just deleting the emails every time I'm done with the meeting. And I keep asking David for the link, you know, so thank you, David. Anyway, I had to make that comment. My last name is Yang, yeah.
Thank you, Jenny.
Sorry, I seem to be interrupting everybody. I apologize,
fine. Go ahead.
Phil and Sharon, or the other person, I'm sorry. It's hard to talk and listen and walk at the same time, I'm realizing. So as far as Phil's question, I would like to say that we have almost come full circle. Like now we are in a pandemic that cannot be addressed simply by intellect. I mean, it has allowed us to look into our hearts, look into our grace, look into our humanity. I mean, it's sad that it has taken such a dire situation for the loop to come around. And then also I'm heartened by, you know, quantum physics. It's kind of that's even physics is coming around to a mythic point of view that, the observer changes the observed, and it depends on where you're standing. And that is the basis of myth, is you have a story that's told from one person to the other. However, it's interpreted differently by each person. And as you go along, it changes too. So there's no one. I know a religion has kind of taken it over. And if anybody's interested in, I've read a lot of Hindu philosophy around this. And there's one professor, he happens to be white, but what can you do? His name is Douglas Brooks. He has done an amazing, and he actually went, the reason I give him my 2 cents, even though he's white, no offense to you, Dr. Marshall, is that he went as a teenager and lived with the guru that knew how to read Sanskrit and had the original text. And he was welcomed by their family, and he stayed there for almost a decade. And then once he could read for himself, then he found, hey, wait a sec, was this interpreted this way by the British? Was this interpreted this way by the Mughals, by the higher priest class, and all of those? So we are coming around. And even if it's not a Indian person or a Hindu person that goes back and looks at the text, there are people that are doing it. So do not lose hope. And we're doing it right now. We're part of it. So Phil, we're all part of it. I would love to read your essay.
Yeah, could I bring up something else? I mean, like David Hume. It seems to me David Hume ran into this problem. Like, in other words, the narrative of causality is not exterior, but is really in the mind. And it's like, but I think like that didn't pick up in the Western tradition, because in that tradition that leads to a kind of solipsism. And so it seems to me Kant took it over and reoriented to a kind of a logical part. I mean, giving kind of a fudge. So it seems to me like on the quantum physicists, in a sense, doing the same thing, you led to this ambiguity, of the duality. I mean, the split atom and so forth, the double slit experiment. But you don't really have an answer because you're still looking outside for it. And instead of like bringing it back David Hume and sort of like reviving it in addition to mythology, I don't think David Hume actually believed in mythology, but he certainly ran into that dead end, as you put it. So
I think part of the problem, Phil, I think, having spent some time myself working through these concepts, is that there doesn't have to be an answer. And that is, I think, the trickiest part, because we are so entrenched in what Kenneth Smith would call our hyper-logical culture. We think that there should be an answer to every question, but the importance of myth shows you it's okay to not have an answer, that there's importance just exploring the topic and generating possibilities together as a culture over time is more important, perhaps, or a complement to having one particular finite discrete answer to a question, which is what the hyperlogical culture would promote. So that's what Kenneth Smith is exploring in his work. And I think when you do the reading, you'll see that it really touches on those issues starkly. I mean, that is the subject of the essay.
Well, the problem with that, being an artist, I understand that. As a matter of fact, it's a matter of exploring and maintaining the mystery. But the problem is now we have developed essentially almost a world culture in which we are given the answers or presumed to have the answers. And even if we don't, we presume that there will be an answer. And so therefore the search into the unknown is something that we are trained, even as an industrial worker, you just do this and that and that and that, right? And so therefore breaking that culture and putting it back into this sort of ability to constantly wonder where it could be, it seems more problematic than the Greeks would have had it. So
this is exactly what Kenneth Smith speaks to when he talks that we don't even really understand what the word myth means properly anymore, because we're so much a product of our own hyperlogical culture that we can't even unpack these concepts without extreme difficulty. I mean, look, Rick had to buy a virtual library of Alexandria to get through some of the writings here. We're so entrenched in this hyperlogical perspective that it makes it difficult to do what you're saying. Yes, that's exactly what Kenneth Smith is talking about.
So I see Jody's got her hand up. Go ahead.
Going to be super quick, Rick, so we can delve into the text really deeply. But even in today's culture, if you look at the interpretation, or in another word, the mythological interpretation of every technology or every thing that's put, every piece of text, every picture that's put out for, let's talk the younger generation. We always like to say, oh gosh, he's got an iPhone and he's whatever. But even in that, there's so much interpretation if we go deeper. And I know that a lot has been swayed the other way, but I feel like it's even in that other end, we are discovering ways to, because we, as human beings, I just don't think that we can live without myth, without that emotional, creative part of us. Everything going into the intellect leads to complete disconnection. And we are a herd species. We are, we are mammals. We need connection. So the intellect is very boundaried. And so if we look deeply into it, you do see it in many, many different ways that, you take an Uber, don't know the person who's driving. You could just sit there quietly in your head, mulling over whatever. Or you could open your mouth and talk to them and have a connection. So even in that very 21st century means of transportation, we as human beings are creating, what we need to survive.
Thank you, Jody. I'm going to take just one more question, then we're going to turn to the text. Richard had his hand up before and just put it up again. So go ahead, Richard.
Okay, yeah, I had my other question. I think I'm going to defer it for later. But I guess I think kind of replying or adding on to, I think what you and Jyoti have been just saying, like kind of our sense of disconnection, and how like the importance of myth, not as understood by modern terms, but understood like how Kenneth Smith is describing it, like causes a disconnection from the past, from each other. Just wanted to kind of bring up again, like I think something I brought maybe a few weeks ago in an earlier discussion, which is like the word anomos, or sorry, anime.
Oh, yes.
Anime. I'm going to type it in the chat. So it comes from the Greek word anomos, which means like without law. So kind of like more updated, I think primarily saved by a French sociologist, Emile Durkheim, who really kind of delved deep into this and kind of trying to understand suicide. I'm just going to read here. Anime is a social condition in which there is a disintegration or disappearance of the norms and values that were previously common to society. The concept, thought of as normlessness, was developed by the founding sociologist Emile Durkheim. He discovered through research that anomie occurs during and follows periods of drastic and rapid changes to the social, economic, or political structures of society. It is, per Durkheim's view, a transition phase wherein the values and norms common to one period are no longer valid, but new ones have not yet evolved to take their place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just posted a quick webpage, and there's a little bit more there, but it's kind of a good one to kind of put in your bookmarks. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
So just a quick reminder for those who weren't here during the weeks when we were doing the diagrams, walking through what we mean by mythos culture. I'm going to give us a hopefully 2-minute version breakdown to orient us to what he's trying to do with yin and yang here. And the reason for that is that yin and yang have very specific meanings in Chinese culture and then a different set of meanings in pop culture. Whereas what he's trying to do is use that to compare it to the structure that he's building out of the Greeks and out of Hegel and Kierkegaard and others of of what a mythos culture would be in its own terms rather than in logos terms. Rather than being a foolish primitive version of ourselves that was trying to explain the world using lies, but that were emotionally compelling, he says it's something else entirely. And there's a structure to this. And it goes like this. I'm typing it into the chat and I'll walk us through it. It's based on the idea that the cosmos is not just a universe. It's not just a great mechanism of parts that move with each other according to laws, but instead it's a whole, that things interact with each other. They're driven by the same fundamental deep principles and laws that are mysterious to us because we see the results of the laws without being able to see the laws themselves. And that it's frequently not through some kind of tidy, organized process of pulling a lever here or moving a gear there, the way that Newtonian physics imagines the cosmos, but instead it's more like modern physics, where you have profound forces moving in different directions, and when they collide with each other, the resolution of that collision produces new movement in a new direction that results in the unfolding of new layers of order. And so you get chemistry out of physics, and you get biochemistry out of chemistry, and you get cellular biology. All these things unfold layer after layer out of the working out of these collisions between these deep fundamental forces that we don't have a clear picture of. And so the Greeks, the archaic Greeks, before they got Apollonianized in Plato's time, they had a biological model of physics in which there are wholes, and the wholes are made up of parts that are themselves also alive, but that through their interactions contribute to the larger whole, and the larger whole contributes to the parts, just like the cells in our body contribute to us being alive, and we eating and breathing and doing the things we're supposed to do contribute to the cells being alive. There's this complex layering of order that happens that's a result of the unfolding of these archi, these deep principles in collision. And so if you want to understand the world and align yourself with it so that it doesn't trample you, you have to try to study it and figure out what those archi are. You have to figure out what their logos is. What are the laws of nature that they act according to? And the more you can figure that out, the more you could try and see how they produce a whole. See how they produce the cosmos, the unfolding cosmos. You could then say, now let's engineer our culture to align it with nature, so that we don't get trampled, so that we can be sustainable, we can be creative and healthy and so forth. And if we don't do that, if we aren't constantly tethered back to the deeper principles of the cosmos, it's a great hazard for us, because we're born with this capacity for abstraction that can lead us to make our decisions and live our lives inside of an imaginary world of theories and ideas. And not only can we do that, we do it if we're not careful. Like Diogenes says, for the proper conduct of life, it requires right reason or a leash. And the resolution here is that we have to leash our reason to the archi of the cosmos. We have to leash our cultures to what's actually true about the world and how it works, or else we hazard becoming self-destructive and destructive of the very conditions of life itself, as we are beautifully illustrating. I mean, we're sort of illustrating these concerns that the archaic Greeks had at a level that they weren't capable of illustrating. They didn't have the power to impose their will upon themselves and nature the way that we do. And so we're better illustrating what they were worried about, because with our atomic bombs and our civil engineering and so forth, we can clear cut an entire forest. We can turn a river into an industrial waste sewage pipe. We can do these things that they couldn't do. And so we can see what the consequences are of leading a very Verstand, noetic, Apollonian kind of logos-oriented life, in which the important thing is what we decide, what we want, and how we impose it on the world. And no longer is the important thing, from our perspective, what's actually true and how do we align ourselves with it? How do we submit ourselves to nature in a healthy, wholesome way? So when he brings in yin and yang, he's talking about them in this particular context, the willfulness of the abstracted intellect that believes it has the right to impose itself on everything. That's a yang thing to do, right? To say, me, I, my vision of the world will be stamped on everything, versus the more gnosic or gnomic mentality that we're born with, the live wire experience of an infant who suffers life as a pathos, right? Everything is touching them and manipulating them and charging them with energy, because they don't have the intellectual framework to envision a different world that they could impose on what's happening. Not to start with. They simply are connected to the way things actually are and are trying to align themselves with it. And so this is a more complex topic about the relationship between the two. Hegel goes into it, Kierkegaard goes into it, and we've talked about it before. But the idea is that what you see in an infant is a very yin experience of the world. Yes, they scream at the top of their lungs for the things that they want, and that's a yang thing to do, but that's also them beginning to diverge from the yin experience of that they're initially born with. They're first born, it's like, wow, here I am. And then after a while, it's like, actually, my tummy hurts. I don't feel all that good. I'm going to impose my will and see if I can do something to summon some assistance. So there's this wrestling match that goes back and forth between the yin and the yang in the infant's relationship to the world. And what he's saying is, what Kenneth is saying here is that corresponds to faculties we're born with mentally, right? To immerse ourselves in the world so that we feel whole, so that we are connected to the world. We know where we fit in the world. We feel like ourselves. That's a very gnosis, very begriff, very yin approach to the world. And then we're also born with this capacity that we don't use at first, but that unfolds in our dissatisfaction with yin by itself. We start to unfold this abstractivizing capacity of our brain that we're born with, to say, can I imagine something better than what I'm feeling right now? Oh, I just pooped myself. This is uncomfortable. I remember when I didn't poop myself and I felt better then. I think I'm gonna exert my will and see if I can summon some assistance to return to that better state. We start to abstract ourselves from our current circumstances and create this other possible life, and then do what we can to impose that on the world and on ourselves. And it begins innocently enough with, well, yeah, of course I'm hungry, I want to eat. But eventually it becomes a whole way of life and a whole mentality that we slip into, where we start trying to interpret everything that way. We start to be distrustful of our feelings and distrustful of our perceptions beyond the level of what would be appropriate and sustainable, and to a level where we become like Spock on Star Trek. And part of us says, you know what? Feelings just can't be trusted. They're no good. We should just suppress all that. And everything should be according to a recipe. And that's how we should interact with the world. We'll just make the perfect mechanism, the perfect set of laws, the perfect economy, all run by numbers and money that calculators can figure out for us. And it'll tell us what to do, and it'll all work out correctly. And the reason it'll work out correctly is not because we actually believe in the truth, the reality of the system, but because we're so afraid of our feelings and of being helpless and immersed in the world that anything is better than merely experiencing the world. This is why Nietzsche says, and I don't think I've quoted this one in this series before, Nietzsche says that we become so addicted to our will, our ego, and imposing our Verstand, our noesis upon the world, that man would rather will the void than be void of will. Better suicide and self-destruction and annihilation that we chose than to have to be subject to nature, even if it would be better that way. We just become addicts. Before I call on you, Phil, I see Richard's had his hand up for a bit, and then I'll call on you.
Oh, just a quick comment, I guess, sort of using Spock as a metaphor, which I don't think is incorrect, but I guess like depending on, which writer, which scripts, I guess you're drawing from, you're going to get a very different view. I mean, like, I think like that sort of archetype or stereotype, is very, I think, applicable from maybe things that were explored in the original TV series. But I think I'm just bringing this up because I was recently reading some pieces, where, where Spock is evoked, from his most powerful moment in The Wrath of Khan, and where he basically states, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one, which is basically just kind of a restatement of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, right?
Yes.
So that's a different, but I think that's a Spock that's sort of grounded, in emotion and kind of in the right place to, guide his actions, I think.
Yeah. I think you're right. If you follow him through the films, he actually becomes a much richer, more complex character as he resolves the struggle between these two sides of himself. It's fascinating. Jody, you got your hand up? Oh, wait, I said Phil first. So Phil and then Jody.
Yeah. It seems to me the approach is finding this balance, okay? But that aside, it almost seems like human beings are by nature flawed in this sense. In other words, we have a desire for understanding, and understanding want to understand, okay? It's sort of understanding does not want to just in and wonder, and we've forgotten that part. But if that's the case, it almost seems like we are born in a sense to eventually fall into this trap of, I wouldn't say overly understanding, but in that sense, since we have this flaw, you would say the cure is not so much to get rid of understanding, but just to urge it to come back into balance with wonderment. I mean, it's like, in other words, that we are not the masters of the universe, and that in a sense we have to come to terms and live with the universe rather than dominating, which is maybe too harsh, or even just understanding it. And it seems to me there's a part of me that is captured by that. I mean, my understanding does want to understand, okay, to the degree that I'm willing, at least in my discipline, and sometimes relinquish that and understand my flaw that I cannot really understand. That I'm just doing is creating, in a sense, this sort of narrative for me to try to understand that the narrative, the story part itself by its own nature is flawed.
Yes. I'm going to just do kind of quick comments here. So let's jump to Jody next. Then I think Joseph had his hand up, and then Marianne.
Just a quick comment. Gosh, I always say that and then it ends up being long. Sorry. One is, since you used the metaphor of the infant, I just wanted to emphasize two of the most important. I've been steeped in parenting for the last 18 years. So that's where I'm drawing all my knowledge from.
Yay.
Two of the most important things I learned as a parent when my child was an infant or a 2-year-old. One was everything unrolls in like an onion. So the yin, the yang, they will all unroll. And the first part is all about yin. And so don't insert yang in there just because you want to, and you're at a different stage of development.
Right.
And that means answering questions like, oh, Mom, why is the sky blue? You answer that with, I wonder, rather than going into explaining the splitting up of sunlight into whatever, just I wonder was one of the phrases that I remember her name still, Miss Anne Marie, passed on to us parents. She was a wise old woman who was just passing on information. And that's one of the, passing on her knowledge that's one of the things that we need to regenerate in our culture, is because it has been there. It just has stopped. The link has been broken of it passing from one generation to another. So one was the I wonder, and the other one was the layers. And then the other one just very briefly, is yang as in being will forces. You will see at certain ages that your child goes towards that. You know,
Yes.
2-year-old, 2 is a very infamous age when
Terrible
they're like,
twos.
yeah, the terrible twos. I'm going to have
Behold,
a
I've
tantrum.
discovered my will.
Exactly.
Let me show it to you.
But the thing was, Miss Anne Marie said, just hold on to your no.
Yes.
I know you want to just let them do whatever they do to make your life easier, but they need to hit a wall. So their yang needs to hit a wall to get stronger. So the will part has to come under control and like, okay, this is the no. And I'm not moving from it. And that's why all this, you know, the 60s movement, the 70s movement, be friends with your child did not work, because a parent is a very different from a friend, because a friend does not impose that no means no. And you can throw a tantrum, you can, you know, but I am going to let you and be here with you while your emotional development happens and your yang development happens. However, I'm not going to skip over it for my convenience.
Thank you, Jody. That's much appreciated. Let's see. I think it was Joseph and then Marianne.
Yeah, I just have a very brief question. Is that we just basically default to order, right? Essentially as a way of thinking, because we like the certainty of answers. Therefore, we revert to a yang type of approach to the world and for our understanding, so that we then have us comfort, and then we're not dealing with uncertainty. So I look at it as kind of like a order and chaos, or even uncertainty. And I've been thinking a lot about the idea of uncertainty and how we actually deal with uncertainty, so that this is why we revert back into this yang type of culture of an industrialized type culture, where I need some certainty as to what the answer is going to be. So am I thinking about this correctly when I'm thinking about the yin and the yang? Is that the yang we default back to is because it's an order, but it's not necessarily the ideal. And then how to embrace uncertainty is essentially with myth, and that leads to an ideal. Is that a way of thinking about it?
So
the only thing I would take exception to
ahead.
there, Joseph, is that I don't know if we fall back on yang. I think that our culture pushes us in that direction and has our entire lives. So that's why it seems like a default. Whereas if we were born, you know, in Hellenic Greek times, our default might be myth. It's just that our culture manufactures that push for obvious reasons, you know, for the economy, businesses need to plan, etc. That's why they need certainty.
Right. So economic systems push us into this order. Okay.
That's my thinking.
No, I agree with that. Thank you.
It'll be interesting to see how much of that lines up as we in the second hour start to get into some of these original Chinese thinkers and what they have to say about the yin and the yang. We can see to what extent is Kenneth doing a good job of lining up yin and yang with Begriff and Verstand, you know, with gnosis and noesis, and to what extent is he sort of warping them a little bit to fit the picture? So it's a little of both, I think, is what we're going to find. But we'll let the Chinese guys speak for themselves as we bring them forward one by one to talk about their philosophies, and then we can sort of see what we think, make up our own minds. Marianne, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
So I wanted to share a moment, like I'm a grandparent, and we were sitting around the dining room table, and an infant was sitting there, and I perceived this white light just coming from this infant. And I think when we're talking about infants and, you know, their pathos, they often have this spontaneous happiness, and you can feel it. So it was such a warm sense of undifferentiated consciousness that in that moment, that being was alive and happy. Have to share.
Thank you. Yeah, there is this, you know, this quote I did earlier from Kenneth about feeling at home in the world. one of the ways that we notice in ourselves that we don't feel at home in the world is when we're parenting a new infant. During the times when the infant's unhappy, obviously all bets are off. But then there are those times when like all their needs have been met and they're like really happy for a moment. You're looking at them and you're looking at their interaction with you in the world, and you're like, I strongly suspect you're happier right now than I have been for the last 20 years. You sort of, there's something that you see in their immersion in the world and their feeling of comfort that they're, they are who they are and they are where they are. And we think, how long has it been since I felt that way ever, about my relationship to the world or myself? And it's not that it's sufficient for us. There's reasons why we leave that behind, but it's that what we've left behind, part of it is something that we need. And that maybe what it means is that where we've journeyed to isn't as simple as saying it's better to be the way that we are as moderns, but that there's things about growing up that are important, and there's things about what the infant has as an experience that are important, and what we need is a third thing that somehow captures more of the good parts of both without seemingly being stuck entirely in the liabilities of the Apollonian culture that we've built for ourselves. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, well, sometimes we ourselves, even if we're sympathetic to that, we just either forget or misunderstand or didn't, whatever. A couple years ago, I used to collect rocks at the beach, right? Sort the beautiful ones. And then what happened was one day I decided, some of the ones not quite as beautiful, I'll return it to the beach, but I left it in a pile. And so hoping maybe somebody else would discover it. So the next day I returned back and it was still there, and I collect some more rocks. And on the way back, a father and a child, which is maybe about 6 months old, was sitting there, and he was busily picking up the rocks. And I walked by because I was the only one that know the backstory. I said, wow, what a treasure trove, right? So I was walking by, and he was yelling at his kid. He said, I told you not to suck on those rocks. Okay. So that, and I was a little taken back, but I walked by, and as I walked by, the kid just took out the rock, and he went like this, and he offered it to me. And I didn't catch it in time because it was kind of like a little bit gross. Plus it's my damn rock anyway. So I walked by, and then like about 30 yards later, I realized I had made a big mistake. I should have thanked him immediately because he had given me the most precious thing in the world.
Yes.
At that moment, I had ignored it. I had dismissed it, and it was too late to go back. Because if I went back, it would be like, in a sense, contradicting what the father was saying.
Yes.
And so I couldn't do that, but I always regretted that moment. Like, there was a kid in the world, he was willing to share everything.
Yes.
And I ignored him. And I didn't say anything nasty, but like, what a mistake. And like, even though I was trained in a sense to like look for beauty in the world, I just missed it. So sometimes we make mistakes.
Yeah. Sharon, go ahead.
So coming back to the text.
Yes.
I appreciated Kenneth Smith interjecting yin and yang in the 4.2 section of the essay. And the question I have is, the other personality subtypes that he identified, the dualist, the Banosaur, the Aristoid, always seem to, in my analysis of it, you had a kind of a chaos. They were at points in time, they were chaos. They never really functioned in a way to add balance to the society. And that's what I saw of the yin and the yang, right? And I really like the very last sentence that he said. He said, in yin and yang, we see the embryos of what we are in essence, our heart of darkness and our light of nature, clinging to one another like twins in the womb of the whole.
Yes.
And so, is that whole balance? I like this whole yin and yang because of the balance that it suggests.
Yeah, let's let's explore that. I mean, I once again, Sharon, you did that thing you do on these seminars. That's a potent sentence that really pulls the whole thing together, and it takes us right to the heart of the issues. So what you find with the discussions of yin and yang in Chinese culture is often, I mean, you can see the similarities to the pop culture versions of yin and yang, but it's obviously more profound because these are the people who are trying to explicate what they mean by it. They're trying to explore the idea and figure out how it applies to the cosmos. And so they're digging deeper than you do when you're just making a necklace and saying, this is cool. This is a cool idea. I think I'll wear it. It's turning into, well, but how do they relate to each other? Are the yin and the yang in balance? Are they in transformation from one to the other, chasing each other around in a circle like little tadpoles? Are they, the Chinese characters for yin and yang? The Chinese character for yang means the sunny side of the hill, and the Chinese character for yin means the shady side of the hill. And part of what's interesting about that is it's the same hill, and that over the course of the day the sun moves, and maybe what was the sunny side becomes the shady side, and what was the shady side becomes the sunny side. So there is some sense that not only are they different from each other, it's not as simple as like gendered languages that simply divide up everything into masculine and feminine, or maybe a third gender, neuter, and then you're done. That's just, they're each in their place, and that's a very Newtonian, everything in its box, the end kind of Verstand way to do things. What we're seeing in these Chinese approaches, right built into the terms themselves, is this idea that the relationship of the positive and negative are more complicated than that there is transformation between them. And that's a critical part of it. And so the question then becomes, is the resulting relationship between them one of balance, or is balance the beginning of describing what's actually some kind of dynamism between them, where they're dynamically creating a whole? Because if it's dynamism, then we're back to ideas more closer to the archaic Greek, where there's conflict built in, and the conflict achieves balance at the same time that there's a conflict, which also is a yin and yang way to talk about yin and yang, if that makes sense. We'll come back to this. I see Richard's got his hand up, but I don't want to talk over him.
Oh, I just wanted to, I think they're related, and maybe like building on that. I've always kind of found fascinating, in certain versions of the Tai Chi symbol, that like within the other side, there's the dot of the other. And I really, really liked the part in this particular section of the essay where, talking about, so if you liken yang to power and yin to weakness, Kenneth Smith goes on talking about the weakness of power, the weakness of he who needs to control, and direct everyone, and then the power of weakness.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting, relationship there. Yeah.
And
I think that's one. Sorry, and one that's been explored, I think, in different ways by multiple philosophers, I think.
Yeah. Back to you, Sharon.
Well, I don't know about the philosophers, but I want to just piggyback on what Richard was saying. The power of weakness and the weakness of power. That comes back to the question that I have about balance. And I think that when you're powerful, you're weak, because you have to go through that power, develop your strength to come to the other side of, and I don't know how to express this well, but it's a continuum. It's a growth process, and I think it's part of our human nature.
Yes. I'm going to take just a second to talk about something that doesn't actually literally fit, because it's not from China. It's from Okinawa, now in Japan. And that is, there's a principle in, I've studied martial arts all my life. It's how I first got into Zen and Taoism and things like that. And there is a principle. It's one of the 10 principles of the guy who first took karate from Okinawa to Japan, what they called the mainland, and started to spread it. And that was the beginning of the worldwide spread of karate. His name was Funakoshi, and he had 10 principles of karate. And one of his principles, one of the critical ones, is he said, there's no first strike in karate. You never attack first. You just don't do it. And it was part of his dojo kun, which is for the dojo where you work out. It's the code of behavior for how you're supposed to treat each other. And so we all assumed that what it meant is, don't be a jerk. don't go out there in the world and be an obnoxious person who's starting fights. And if you do that, you don't deserve to learn karate. Karate's not for you. It's for people who will be gentle. They say the greatest karate master is the one who learns all the things and develops themselves physically and psychologically and teaches people, and yet never gets in a fight in their whole life, because what they've learned is how to control their anger and how to deal with others in ways that don't require martial arts. They're no longer afraid of their anger, and they're no longer a prisoner of their anger. It's a servant. But there's another level to this, which is very yin and yang, which I want to talk about just briefly. And that's the word for block in Okinawan karate doesn't mean block. Most karate practitioners, they learn the word block as uke, U-K-E, uke. And so, if you do a block, it's some kind of uke. But the more perspicuous observers will tell you uke doesn't mean block. It means receive. It means receive. And that you don't actually do the medieval style parry or block in Okinawan martial arts. You do in Japanese, because that's the way Funakoshi taught it, because he didn't teach them the Okinawan way. Okinawa was not happy about having been taken over by Japan. So they limited what they told them. They taught them this very yang style punch, kick, block. But in Okinawa, what you do is the reason you don't attack first is whoever attacks first loses. Because the attack that they throw out there, before you attack, when you're watching each other, you're in gnosis, you're in begriff, you're very observant. You have to be completely receptive to their body language, their eyes, shifting of their muscles. You're working out what's going to happen. You are as connected as you possibly can be. You're reading them. But the moment that you decide to attack, you have to take your attention off of your opponent and put your attention onto your own biophysics and how you're going to launch this attack and your strategy. You, for a second, get sucked out of gnosis and into noesis while you plan your attack and then go through the things to deliver it. And while you're doing that, you are in a moment of vulnerability, because at that moment, you are no longer attuned to what's happening. And meanwhile, the defender is still in a state of gnosis, and they can see your attack coming, probably before you even fully launch it, because they see the shift in your stance and the tensing of muscles, and they read, maybe your eye flicks down to the chest where you were going to punch, and they see that, and they say, here comes the punch. And so what they do is they receive your attack, and then judo style, in the way the Okinawans used to do it, they let your momentum work against you. And so maybe the punch gets pulled down towards the ground, and now you're on the ground. You thought you were the attacker and the aggressor, and yet somehow you've fallen down, right? Or they'll spin your arm around and lock it behind your back, and now you can't attack with that arm. Whatever attack you put out there is meant in anger, but it's actually a gift to end the fight. And that the uke, which is not only the name for the block, i.e. the receiving, it's also the name for the role of the person who doesn't attack first. In combat and sparring, they call that person the uke. That's the person who will usually win if they're good, because the other person has given them the gift of ending the fight by being aggressive and throwing some attack out there, which they can then use against them. So there is this yin and yang, Begriff Verstand, Tori is the attacker, uke is the receiver thing going on deep in Okinawan martial arts as well. And it's, it's not just a technique for them. It's like a whole philosophy in Okinawan martial arts about how you relate to the world. So what you said, Sharon, put me in mind of that.
Yes, thank you for that.
Sure.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ginny, and then Phil.
How is it that Rick, Professor Marshall, you know so much about so many different subjects, and I'm constantly astounded by what you know. It's just amazing.
He's been alive a long time.
That's right. You would think that he's lived 150 years by now.
I'm filled with foolishness. I have a voracious curiosity.
I mean, I can listen to Rick all day, you know,
Oh,
for
God.
what he has to say.
You're killing me, Jenny. I'm just a student.
Yes.
Well, there you modesty too on top of everything else.
I have is there anybody else?
Yeah, Phil. Phil was going to say something.
Yeah, going back to this yin and yang, the sunny side of the hill and the shady side of the hill, it seems to me like the thing is the hill. I mean, it is one. And I think the problem with Western thinking is even the people who are kind of like the most yin, you would say, still think of the other as the other, right?
Yes.
The otherness. And
Yes.
which means the other, the most you could do is like you can never really understand the other because they are the other, and all you could do is be empathetic to the other rather than the fact that they are indeed an extension of yourself. And I think that becomes a problem because you're already divided from the very beginning. Even if you're empathetic, it's like you include the other, but the other is always the other distance from you in a sense. So this whole idea of like understanding the sunny side and the shady side is the same hill. I mean, it's
not, I would say
it's really important.
Phil, I would say maybe it's not the same hill, but it's the same light. It's the light that is the same. That the idea of yin and yang is that the opposites include each other. So we think of hot and cold as two distinct things, but actually they are one and the same. You cannot have the idea of hot without understanding the idea of cold. It's not as much that they're a continuum as though they are, but the dot in each in the yin and yang shows you that you cannot have a sun without darkness. And so it's not the hill that's the same, it's the light. And if you see, for the second half of your statement there, I was just interested, you said you couldn't understand someone because they're other. You could only have empathy for them. But if you truly have empathy, I think you could understand them. I mean, that's what empathy is, isn't it? Is going into yourself, accessing those feelings, saying, I could easily be just like that person. And so I'll be empathetic towards them because I see that in myself as well, even though maybe I made different choices. So there's the unifying principle there. If you're struggling, there's a unifying principle there in empathy. I don't know if that helps you.
Yeah, but it does seem to me if you take that position of the other, which by the way I do, is that there is.
I don't. I would say that I really firmly believe that there is no other, that we're all a part of one cosmic, and maybe that's where the yin and the yang comes into play.
Maybe, if I could try to maybe like help clarify this discussion a little bit by maybe introducing some terms. Let's humor me, and so I'm going to draw from an author. His name is I was pronouncing it. I'm just going to copy paste it to the chat window.
Please.
He's Tibetan, and for many years. Oh, thank you, Sharon. Thumbs up. For many years, he was the translator and writer for the Dalai Lama. And then, kind of at an older age, 40 or so, like he decided to, still take his teachings, but kind of live in the secular world. Like he, got married, got a family. He teaches at McGill University in Montreal. He's also a fellow with, he's at the Stanford Institute of Compassion. And he describes, so he has three terms, like, so empathy, sympathy, and compassion. And so empathy is trying to, understand the other person's view from their own eyes, okay? And sympathy is wanting to improve their condition and their suffering, and compassion is the action, like, of carrying that out. So I think, like, in terms of, like, trying to understand the other, it's difficult. It's easy to, sometimes these terms kind of get conflated, but like, it's easy to, sympathize, agree with someone, whose situation is maybe unfortunate, but not too far from yours. But like to really have kind of superhuman levels of empathy, it is trying to get and see the perspective of situations that normally would, cause a very visceral reaction or revulsion. And often, sometimes in our culture, the reaction is to basically totally other that just to evil, right? So yes, I see Sharon wanting to.
So yeah, I think Sharon, then Jody, then Joseph.
I really want to get in on this. First of all, I want to address something Phil said about the other. One of the reasons that I really like yin and yang is because it's complementary. And I think there is no other. What we have and what we all share is a common humanity. And that's the way I see it. And I want to follow up on Richard about the definition between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. As a physician, that's one of, yeah?
Sharon, excuse me, would you please make sure that you clarify the word complementary since it has two different meanings? Please clarify or define that term. I agree with you, it's appropriate, but please define what you mean by it.
Oh.
When you say yin and yang are complementary.
I think you mean like complementary with an L, with L-E or M-I.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, she broke my train of thought.
Not complimentary.
I wanted to really amplify what Richard said about empathy, sympathy, and compassion, because I'm a physician and you use those all the time.
Right.
Empathizing means I can look at you and you're in a bad situation and I can do what I can to help you, but my emotional response is not there with you. Sympathize is when I actually cry or shed tears or whatever it is, or whatever the emotion is with you. But compassion is the act. What can I do to help you? And that's the way that you navigate through all the pathos that you continually see.
Thank you for that, Sharon.
I need to get back into this because I need to explain myself in this sense.
Well, if you can hold that just for a moment, Phil, we got a line here for the talk. So I want to do Jyoti, then Joseph, and then we can call on you, Phil.
Yeah.
Whoops. Just quickly. Oh, I should not start my comments with that. I just wanted to say that, like we were talking about the other. And having been in a psychiatric group where there's 6 or 7 of us, and we are all trying to resolve some, the trauma. Some trauma has brought us there, or many traumas have brought us there. And what was most powerful for me was that when somebody tells their story, there are certain parts in which you are like, oh my gosh, and you just start to cry or you start to feel their emotion. And that just speaks to yourself. It doesn't speak to them. It speaks to a part of yourself that you have not resolved, that has shown up in their particular situation, that you kind of see in their situation. So there's, I don't know how you want to categorize it between empathy, sympathy, compassion, but you can only, you can only connect with that if there's a part of you that has not resolved it. And then you take on that emotion and you need to do some work on that, grieve and get it out of your soma, your body. So all this just brought that. So it's not like there's an other, but because that person, obviously their experience is different from mine. And whatever little happened was that initiated such a strong reaction in me. But though is something that I have not resolved. However, that emotion itself is universal. The story may not be. I feel like I'm going in circles, but
I think it makes sense. Thank you, Jyoti, for introducing that. Joseph and then Phil.
I was just thinking really quickly because I've thought a lot about empathy in general, and sympathy and compassion, and how it relates to the whole in general, and specifically how we're not able to crowd out our bias with empathy. And that's problematic because then we only empathize with things we identify with. And if you're only empathizing with things that you identify with, then you're not seeing the whole. So think of the planet as a whole, you know, that there are sentient human beings. But this could be also the basis for things like racism as well. You know, so I don't empathize because I don't, you know, you're not the same as I am. So I see you as different. And this is where the othering kind of comes in. And so there is a downside to empathy in this regard. I look at empathy a lot different. I know I'm expressing some of the thoughts of, like, there's a Yale professor that has this perspective. But when I think about it and think in terms of the whole, there's an imbalance that comes, and our cognitive bias fits into this, is to how it ultimately could actually be a negative in certain cases as well. So there's a lack of balance that's involved with this as well. The other thing is, I've also heard, and I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on the idea of sympathy, sometimes feeling disconnection, in addition to, you know, as opposed to, if you sympathize with somebody, you're automatically creating a hierarchical relationship, right? That you need to step in and then, you know, help in some way, shape, or form, or, you know, I feel badly for you. You know, you're not identifying with the person, as opposed to you're actually. So in terms of the whole, this creates a certain level of imbalance automatically as well. So these emotions that we have, if we're not applying reason, so there's an idea of rational empathy. And that part I haven't really thought, I haven't thought through enough to really talk about. But some of these things that we're discussing, there's a balance to them, and there's a cognitive bias to them that we need to account for in order to really think about things in terms of the whole. And even to our point where species, like how our species interact with, you know, other species. So so how we look at you know, animals and the planet as the whole. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank
I'm going to
you.
call on Phil and then Sharon, and then I'm going to take us back to the text.
Well, perhaps it's because I'm too caught up in dualism in a way, and I understand that. But on the other hand, it just seems to me it's actually a matter of respect for other to understand otherness in this sense. The others, there's always a part of them that's a mystery to me that I could never understand because they live in a different condition than I am. And so therefore, if I don't respect the otherness as partly differentiated, some part that I will never know, then in a sense, I've also left out certain something, because then I will only deal with what is mutually common to me, the part that I already know. Since I already understand that I myself am flawed and therefore incomplete in myself, and therefore I could never understand the completeness of the other, it just seems to me that you can't just answer the question like everything is one, because I do live in a world in which I do believe that, but on the other hand, I also am differentiated. So not only the other, but the whole concept of otherness is operating in a world in which I'm constantly asked to differentiate myself from different things. And I have to respect the other, because there's always a mysterious part of the other that I do not understand.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to call on Sharon in a sec. There's a challenge here that we have in, you know, our Verstand Our noesis wants to resolve paradoxes because it treats them as contradictions, but sometimes paradoxes are true. They're an inevitable result of the fact that we're looking at a multifaceted, multidimensional reality from a single perspective. And from a single perspective, the thing that's actually going on is unresolvable. And the author of Flatland played with that a whole bunch about, how weird do three-dimensional things look to two-dimensional people as their plane of as it passes through their plane of existence. And so it produces these paradoxes, but they're not false. They're an inevitable result of the limitations of the mortal perspective. And so the question of the one versus the many comes into play here. Is everything one or is everything manyfold? And of course, it can't accurately be answered yes or no. It's got to be that this problem bedevils us because of the mortal perspective. It is both true that it's one and true that it's many. It's both true that the other person has so much in common with us that it's like we have a shared experience. And at the same time, it's also true that they are an other. They are a separate person with their own experience. And one of the ways that you can see the importance of being able to shift between both modes play out is in Kenneth Smith's core idea that our temptation when experiencing new ideas is to torture them on the Procrustean bread of our mind and make them fit our preconceptions. Mm-hmm. And when we do that, we make them one with ourselves. But what we've done that by doing violence to them and by warping the ideas out of what they really mean. And that the thing we really need to learn how to do to transcend that and become philosophical, to not be prisoners of a mono perspective, is to get to the position where we can learn to represent other perspectives as themselves, separate from the perspective that we have, and then be able to shift back and forth between them and use them to comment on each other. And so there's a power to being able to create the differentiation of the other. It can't be done in just a self-good, other bad way, but if we refuse to other things and to let them be what they are in their own right, separate from our interpretation, then we're never going to escape the trap of our mind. We're always going to be stuck in our own perspective. So it's only when we can create an other perspective and move into it that we liberate ourselves. This is like, core Kenneth Smith stuff. So for that, I'm sort of underscoring what you're saying, Phil, and saying there's a value to this.
Let me add something to that, because as an artist, I know this because Cézanne is a very important artist. Mm-hmm. And like, if you see particularly his later work, there are many parts that are kind of like left with blank canvas.
Yes.
And some people interpret that as like, okay, that is the representation of nothingness and all that, which is more advanced than him. He just didn't do it because he didn't know how to do it. He left that part blank because it was mysterious and unknown. And then for him to fill it up with something, a color that didn't seem to be right, it just seemed to be a violence to the unknown rather than, oh, that's a representation of nothingness. So, I mean, wow. In that sense, like you understand him better because he was struggling with trying to understand. He said, this part I just do not understand.
I'm going to call Sharon next, but thank you for introducing that, because I had no idea that's what Cézanne was doing. And I'm never going to forget that now that you told me. That's beautiful. Everyone's like, he's discussing the power of nothingness. He's like, no, I just can't do justice to that thing. I'm going to leave it alone.
But I have a question.
Sharon.
And I want to follow up on something that you said, Rick. You said we're one, but there are multiples in the one. I want you to, if you can address the question of boundaries.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the difference between sympathy and empathy, in my experience, is a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how that comes in philosophical terms. I'm empathizing with you because I see the situation is bad, but I am not emotionally involved with you. When I'm sympathizing with you, I've merged that boundary. I am emotionally involved with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a question of the other, and I said I don't see the other. We're all human, but we all have boundaries.
Yes.
That's what makes us so different. And it's that integration of that difference that I think contributes to our experience.
So let me talk about that. I think you're, once again, you're pointing us right at the potent thing here, right? So I grew up in an abusive household. My parents were had full of amazing, wonderful qualities and introduced me to great things and made me a curious person and love animals and love nature, blah, blah, blah. But it was also an abusive household with alcoholism and, emotional and physical abuse and mental illness and all kinds of other things. And so I needed a lot of therapy. when I left home, I was in therapy for 24 years, doing a second childhood, going back through everything and trying to figure out how many of my assumptions were actually dysfunctional assumptions. And the thing that took me the longest was boundaries. And the reason it took me the longest is that in an abusive household, there is a differentiation of roles. There's the abuser, and the abuser is allowed to have a will and an ego and impose themselves on the world around them. And then there are the abused, who are not allowed to have boundaries and not allowed to resist the world that's being stamped out by the abuser, right? You're supposed to be a supplement to the hero of the story, who's the abuser. The hero of the story is the only one who's allowed to be a fully manifested person. And so if you grow up in that sort of a household, you can either become the rebel, in which case you get to set boundaries early, but you get punished for it, or you become a mediator, facilitator, communicator, which is what I fell into as a role. And the problem with doing that is that the way you do it is by having no boundaries. You end up apologizing for the abuser and empathizing with them and sympathizing both, so that you can, absolutely adapt to them and not trigger them as often. There's this realm in which you become a supplement to the other person. And the problem is when you go out into the world as an adult after that, you actually are incompetent to interact with people socially, because every abuser for miles around smells you and is like, this guy's great. I need some money, Rick. I need some of your time, Rick. I need this, I need that. And of course you say yes, because you were taught that saying no is a crime. You can only say yes. You're not allowed to have boundaries. And so, 24 years of therapy, what it taught me is, you can't differentiate yourself as a person or protect yourself enough to be effective in the world unless you develop those boundaries. What you're talking about, Sharon, is it's crucial. It's crucially important. And my own life was sort of a case study in what happens if you go too far the other way without the boundaries. Most of my problems in my life from my first 35 years were caused from inadequate boundaries and not knowing how to do that. And I have plenty of problems now, but to the extent that I've moved on to new and more interesting problems, it's because of learning how to do that. And someone had to teach me. I mean, I was too far into gnosic mode of being immersed and passive and not enough asserting myself. So I'm all over what you're saying, Sharon. I think that's beautiful. Jody, and then we'll go back to the text.
Gosh, we hardly seem to be able to get the text. It's such a interesting topic for everybody. As far as boundaries and roles, the male, female is concerned, is I just wanted to give I've also been in therapy for a long time, Rick, so I really appreciate you sharing that. I know it's not very easy.
It gets easier.
It does, yeah. So it has gotten much easier for me too, having lived through a lot of trauma. What I wanted to say is, when you have some kind of communion with nature, and we were talking about other species, my daughter loves to ride horses. So it was interesting that she had a very strong personality, or a very strong sense of self. However, she didn't have yang, so to say. She was such a perfectionist that she would let others alter her creation. Oh, this is not so enough. So, oh yeah, you're right. This is not so enough. And then she got on a horse and got connected. There's a whole process of connection with a horse.
Yes.
And once she got connected with the horse, if she didn't assert her yang, gosh, Abby was like, I'm having a great day today.
Yes. Yes.
I'm going to eat all the leaves and the grass and everything. So she had to bring in, and that was instant feedback, which is something that we don't have in other relationships. Sometimes is instant feedback. Hey, you got to assert your yang, And then, oh, you got to step back and let the horse, you know, you guys are cruising, so let the horse be. So there's so many ways to develop that it was just really so beautiful to see the way that she learned how to be in a state of yang and how to use the power of it, however, not to be controlled by it or control others by it. It's more a way of, anyhow, I think I've stated what I needed to.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a complicated thing, the relationship between these different modes. So when I say I'm going to take us back to the text, what I'm actually going to do is take us to a diagram that is, as far as we know, the first yin and yang diagram ever developed to illustrate the principles. And what shocked me is how late it came in history. When I was looking for original sources on yin and yang, you know, I went back to the I Ching, because all of the little, you all know what the I Ching is, the you know, kind of fortune telling book, oracle that's based on solid lines and dashed lines. So the broken lines are the yin, represent the yin, and the solid lines represent the yang. And they did them in different triad combinations and then in different hex combinations where it was 6. And some Western folks noticed that, well, it's almost like binary, and they started talking about, you know, how it's cool, it's like a binary encoding system, but that wasn't what they meant at all. That wasn't what they were doing with it at all. So, but the I Ching doesn't have any actual diagram of yin and yang per se. It assumes you already know what they are, and it starts using them in these sophisticated ways to try to develop a cosmology for seeing the future. So I was shocked, and then I discovered. And here's a book that I'm going to point you guys to. If you're really into the I Ching specifically, this is a great book on it. It's by Richard Rutt. It's called Zhou Yi, a new translation with commentary. And I'm going to link to the Amazon, but get it wherever you want to get it. And what's great about this translation is that most people try to put the two together. They try to put together what turned out to have been different compositions that the Chinese put together in their Middle Ages. But the actual core of the I Ching is this oracle called the Zhou Yi that predates all the rest of the commentaries that have been included with it. And in order to try to make a whole out of it, medieval Chinese would take the commentaries and insert them into the original Zhou Yi text as though they had been there all along, and then try to read the results of the oracles as though it included all this medieval commentary. And the medieval commentary came from the period when the Chinese really got serious about talking about yin and yang and diagramming yin and yang and explaining it as a cosmological thing. The ideas of yin and yang went way back into the BCE, but they hadn't been explicated the way that the medievals did. And so they were sort of retroactively creating this I Ching out of these two separate things. This guy's the first translator in English who really separates them out and lets you see the differences in worldviews between the people who created the original oracle and the later medieval commentators who were attempting to graft everything together into a new Neo-Confucian cosmology. When I found that, I was surprised. Of course, this is not what I ever heard about the I Ching. I didn't know it was this kind of palimpsest. So then I went looking for other references, and I went to my favorite, which is the Dao De Jing, which I've been into since I was little. And I was shocked to discover that the words yin and yang only appear exactly once in the whole Dao De Jing, the fundamental book of Taoism. They're in chapter 42, and I put that quote in the meetup commentary. Well, I tried to. I did in the Portland group. I didn't in the Seattle group because I was blocked for posting too many things. Sorry, but it's the part where it says the way gives birth to the one gives birth to the two give birth to the three, and the three give birth to the 10,000 things. That's like from the opening of chapter 42 of the Dao De Jing, and it's the very next sentence that talks about. I'm gonna go back to the meetup if I can real quick, because that's the closest place where I have that quote. No, I've got a closer place where I have it. I put a link to Daoistic.com Dao De Jing Lao Tzu. This is a guy who did a translation of the Dao De Jing where he tried to be literal. He was a critic of many of the translators who imposed their own interpretation on it and didn't give you the original words. And so he tried to get back closer to the original words, which makes it interesting. If you follow that link and you click on number 42, you'll see the quote. After 3 gave birth to all things, it then says, all things carry yin and embrace yang. They reach harmony by blending with the vital breath. That's it. Out of the whole Dao De Jing, that's the only time he actually says the words yin and yang. In the entire rest of the book, you almost can't not see yin and yang. They're everywhere, right? I mean, anybody who's from the moment you open the Dao De Jing and its opening words about the way that could be walked is not the eternal way. It's like there's yin all over this, right? There's the mystery of nature and the difficulty that we as egos have trying to relate ourselves to nature. But he just doesn't come out and say it, right? He's talking around it all the way, except in this one sentence. And of course, there's no diagram. What we think of as the yin and yang Taoist symbol is nowhere to be found in the Dao De Jing. The Dao De Jing was just text, beginning to end. So, I found myself struggling. Well, if it's not in the I Ching and it's now not in the Dao De Jing, where is it? Where did all of this come from? The kind of what we've built up over the years as our concept of yin and yang, and that was what my education of the last week was about. So I want to take you back to one medieval guy. He's not the first, but he's the most prominent. I put him in the text chat a little earlier. His name is Zhou Dunyi. Zhou Dunyi, and I'm going to share my screen if I can. We'll see if I've still got the ability to do that. Hey, what do you know? Zhou Dunyi. So this is Zhou Dunyi. We should click on him and show a picture of him. Hi, Zhou Dunyi. We don't really know a lot about what he looks like. He was heavily respected later. Other people sort of rediscovered him and made him famous in China. But during his own time, he was not all that famous. He didn't rise to the top of any government hierarchies. There was no great school that was founded based on his writings. It was a successor to the people that he trained later who rediscovered him and said, how did you people all miss Zhou Dunyi? This guy was great. He was this self-effacing guy. And we have 2 books left over from him. And one of the books is the first Chinese work that explicitly talks about yin and yang and the whole that they create together as a subject and nothing else. It's not trying to be an oracle. It's not trying to talk about Taoism. It's not, all these other things that other works have done. He just flat out wrote this thing that said, it's called the Taiji Tushuo, Explanations of the Diagram of the Supreme Ultimate, or Diagramming Explaining the Supreme Ultimate. And this is where he tries to lay out the cosmology of yin and yang. And what I'm going to do is click on this picture and zoom in so that we can see his diagram that he created from scratch to try to illustrate the relationship between the one and the many, between the two, between the elements as the Chinese understood them, and so forth, where everything comes from. And look at that symbol. This is not the swimming tadpoles, right? This is not what Kenneth Smith talks about. He's talking about a different symbol, which we'll come to anon. This is the oldest symbol we have for yin and yang from Chinese history. And it put me in mind of something that Jody said earlier about watching a child's yin and yang unfold like an onion, stage of development after stage of development, right? You can, are those not layers? And in the layers, yin and yang are reversing themselves. Which part is yin and which part is yang is changing as we build outward. Now that's potent right there, right? This is again implying that yin and yang are not just little categories we sort everything into and then we're done, the end, check that off and move on. It's rather that there is shift, there's growth happening, and there's shift, and there's even reversals and paradoxes occurring in the relationships between yin and yang. And it implies motion, right? I mean, it may not be the swimming tadpoles, but you can sort of see a growth outward and a flipping going on. There's it's hard to look at this diagram and not see development and movement, right? It's there. Now, when we look at the text that he wrote, when he talks about the emergence of these qualities in nature, you can't read this and not recognize that he's read the Dao De Jing. Like, from the way to the one to the two to the three to the many, he's explicating it here. He's just expanding on it. So there's no doubt that this guy read the Dao De Jing. But what's fascinating about this period, which is around 1000, 1070 BC, CE, what's fascinating about it is he's not a Taoist. He's a Neo-Confucian. What was happening is before this period, there were a number of deeply competing philosophical schools. Taoism, Buddhism, Moism, which we hardly even know about today, Confucianism. Confucianism in theory got an early start, and yet all these other schools came along and was sucking people away from Confucianism into these other approaches, philosophical approaches to the world. And the Confucianists were frustrated. And there came this period around the thousands when they launched a new effort to make sense out of the world and to revise Confucianism to attract away the followers of the other belief systems. Confucianism underwent a revolution, and it became something very different than it had been under Confucius, and also different than what it had been under Mencius, his successor. It became a different thing. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
Well, what you're saying just takes me to one of the big questions I had as I read through this, how the yin and the yang underlined, impacted, and influenced the mythos culture of that time.
Yes.
And that's where, because Kenneth's, this series we're doing is about mythos and logos.
Yes.
And he's talking about yin and yang as, I guess, as a comparison to the culture, the sub-personality types of the West.
Yes.
But how did this evolve and impact the culture of the East? I see that the religions, Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, all have the underpinnings of the yin and the yang. So how did that impact the mythology of their culture? I don't know if that's too long a question.
It's right on the money. And this is the right guy to be talking about that with, because this guy, Zhou Dunyi, he was attempting to reinvent Confucianism in a way that instead of opposing the other religions, it integrated them and created a new whole, a Neo-Confucianism that incorporated different ideas from different sources. This is one of the things that when students of religion in the West try to understand how religion works in the East, it's often confusing, because in the West, we were all killing each other over even the most minor differences in our theories about the nature of the godhood or about how you're supposed to worship properly. Horrific wars, torture, all kinds of horrible things. Meanwhile, in China, it's not that they didn't have those wars. It's that the resolution often didn't end in victory. It ended in a synthesis of something new. And so as Chinese history progresses, you get this relationship among these different philosophical schools where they interpenetrate each other. The boundaries change and they become more like organic boundaries where, like in the forest, the fungus hyphae interpenetrate the roots of the trees. And, we used to think in the 20th century that was a corruption and we should use fungicides to get rid of the fungi. But it turns out they're actually helping each other. And the fungi are able to do a better job of collecting minerals, for example, and they pass them into the roots of the trees. The trees are better at creating glucose from the leaves, which they then pass to the fungi. And so you really couldn't have a forest if you tried to purify it and create a clean boundary between things. Organic things always have these interpenetrating boundaries. It's one of the 15 principles of living systems that Christopher Alexander writes about. And you can see it here in the relationship between these schools of philosophy in China. Is they're a kind of religion unknown to us, because the kind of religion that we know about is the religions have to fight for who wins and then exterminate all the rest, and that's the way it works. Or maybe they respect each other but they're separate from each other, and they can talk to each other but they're still each their own thing. This idea that they're going to transform each other, and not just by accident but on purpose, and say, I want Confucianism to now move in this direction. As a Confucian, I want Confucianism to now change from its perfect origins. Instead of slamming down sort of an orthodoxy and insisting that that's the way, they say, now let's incorporate that with Taoism. Let's incorporate it with Buddhism. Let's incorporate Moism and make a new Confucianism. And then they do it. And then like that becomes Confucianism for the next 700 years of Chinese history is the synthesis of these ideas. Go ahead there. I see you got your hand up. Not Richard, Marianne.
Yes, I'm a person who loves Jeremy Lint, and he wrote The Patterning Instinct. And it is fundamental to our human nature to try to pattern things. And the Chinese pattern, in my understanding of his work, is that it's a relationship culture. And we are not. We are a dominant yang kind of culture. And I think when you were talking about the forest, I really understood on some level recently that the only way Western society can really function is if we get rid of this sense of monism, one religion is the best religion. We have to become much more pluralistic and incorporate on all the religions, because any religion that thinks that it has the solution, or any humanism that doesn't incorporate the other, will only try to dominate and destroy the other. So I totally believe that on some level, the Chinese being a relationship culture, we have to learn from that.
Thank you, Marianne. Richard, you got your hand up.
Well, I would have to make a push for Ken Wilber as the author to study on those topics. He's done a great job of constructing a model called integral theory that includes all religion and all the great spiritual traditions of mankind and how they all interrelate and how they all work together. And exactly what you're talking about, Marianne, that we all, no one is better than the other, but they all have a core at the center of them, the target of the bullseye. And that core, when you concentrate on it, is solid gold. Yeah, and they all agree on those issues. They disagree on the details forever, but as long as you concentrate on that core, then you're probably right on the money. So yeah, Ken Wilber definitely should be.
Please put that.
Oh yeah, it's in there already. It's in there.
I typed it into the
you
chat.
Typed it in because
Yeah.
that's my exploration. That's my journey. And
thank you, David.
Yes.
So I'm going to call on Richard and then James, but before I do, I think we should all just pause for a moment and reflect on the fact that we managed to find a subject that made David actually come off of mute and say something in one of these. He does all the work to set these up. He does all the work to help us select them, and then he's almost always silent, beginning to end on these chats. And we must have tickled his fancy because he broke his silence to share Ken Wilber with us. So I'll
What's
definitely.
the name of the book? Ken Wilber.
Yay, David!
I'll throw something in when I need to.
So I'll definitely be following up on Ken Wilber, because if it made David come out of his shell and tell us about it, you just know it's a big deal. Richard, then James.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a happy accident, because actually I was making my point and then I realized I was on, and then like David came in, I'm like, what? And then I realized that my mic was muted.
Oh yeah, you were on mute.
Like not in Zoom, but like on the microphone itself. But anyway, like a little earlier when you were discussing like how like the different Chinese religions like kind of like borrowed and improved upon each other. I mean, to be fair, I mean there's some of that in Christianity, but because like Christianity is so dominant, we sort of forget about that. I mean, like just our biggest festival, Christmas. Yeah. Is borrowed from like the big large pagan festival, so it was like a big marketing thing to basically kind of like try to bring that in, right? So I think
yeah
it's comment if oh sorry,
no, go ahead.
Just a quick comment a little late on Ken Wilber. He also teaches, if anybody is interested, on Mind Valley. Mind Valley is an organization that is focused on education and have some interesting courses related to spirituality as well. So he's there if anybody is interested to check it out.
If you could type that name into the chat, I'll definitely follow up. Thank you for mentioning that. James, go ahead.
Yeah, talking about the Eastern and Chinese philosophies, and sometimes you refer to them as religions. They're kind of like you know, a little bit of both, isn't it? It's not purely a religion where they actually worship a deity, but you know, but there is a kind of like a devotion to some idea. But the idea of reality is not something that is necessarily transcendent, right? Which is seems to be the mythology of what is understood to be real is not outside of nature, outside of this world, as in Western logocentric, you know, religion and philosophy.
Yeah.
That's there's so there was maybe that kind of you know, Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism. They all kind of try to you know, think of what is real is in this world, and we're part of that nature.
Yeah, that's right.
And kind of like there's more grounding in what is you know, to what is real than maybe that's one of the, I don't know, but then you know, it all collapsed with the with the revolution.
Yeah. Well, but there's transformations happening there now as a result of, you know,
right,
the new era.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
You know, there's a tendency when people in the West are trying to understand Chinese philosophy to dehistoricize it and make it something as though it had always been the way that it is now. That, you know, for example, the idea that the Taiji symbol, which is the unification of yin and yang, that didn't used to be two tadpoles swimming, that it didn't used to be the two things circling, that it used to be these concentric circles. It's sort of shocking because it kind of slaps us into realizing how abstract our view of Chinese philosophy is. That it's sort of timeless and personless and changeless, when the truth is, like any other philosophical tradition, you know, there were individuals and movements that wrestled with each other and wrestled with how they wanted to understand the world. You can see pieces of that right here in this quote on this the Wikipedia article on Zhou Dunyi is not bad. It's you know, there's some articles you read and you're like, dear God, who wrote that? This is no help at all. Some of them you read and like this one, and it actually points you in helpful directions. So in his book, the Taiji Tushuo, I'd like to draw particular attention to this passage where he says, because of the abundance of energy in Taiji, which is the dynamic whole, it began to move and thus produced the yang, the positive cosmic force. When the activity of the yang reached its limit, it reverted to tranquility. Through tranquility, the yin, the negative cosmic force, was generated. When tranquility reached its limit, it returned to movement, yang. Thus, yin and yang generated each other. So there's some things about this that are very historically specific that need to be talked about. One thing that needs to be talked about is that China's been patriarchal for a very long time, very patriarchal. I mean, I'm sure people remember the news from a few decades ago where there was a problem in China of too many boys and not enough girls, because boys were so cherished that people were abandoning their girl children out to die because they didn't want a girl. They wanted boys. Boys were where all the esteem was. And that's the kind of, you know, shows the prominence of the patriarchy. And it's ironic that we would be the ones issuing that criticism when we look at how patriarchal the West has been for such a long time, right? So I'm not playing ethnocentrism here, trying to say they are and we're not. They're both patriarchal. But the specific approach to the relationship between yin and yang in these opening sentences, even though it concludes by saying that yin and yang both generate each other, and he implies that it's a feedback loop, he also starts with this: in the beginning, there was Taiji. So he's arguing that yang came first. He's arguing that out of the Taiji, the energy generated yang. And when yang exhausted itself, that generated yin. This is not identical to the Hegelian dialectic. It's obviously related to it, the idea of the two in energetic relationship to each other generating a direction. That's definitely dialectical. But in Hegel's dialectic, Begriff, the noesic, immersive, concrete, holist mode of thought comes first. We're born that way. When we're first born, that's what we are. We're plugged into nature and the world. We're live wires. And our abstractivizing nature, right? The yang, the I will impose my will upon the world by by envisioning an abstract world and caring about that one more than the actual one, and then insisting that I change the actual world to match my abstract world, that emerges only secondarily as a reaction against the limitations of being 100% begriff, being too passive, too subject to the forces in the world around you. You start wanting to exert some control. And that they struggle back and forth, but that what you're searching for under a Hegelian model, which Kierkegaard and Kenneth Smith build off of, is not merely to stay in a state of those two modes circling each other or interacting with each other, right? Neither Begriff nor Verstand nor Begriff plus Verstand is enough under the Hegelian model, because Begriff has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses, right? The immersive, concrete experience of life. And likewise, Verstand has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses, the abstractivizing, cool, detached, intellectual approach to the world. And that no matter how you spin them around or mix them, there's no compromise anywhere between them that yields wisdom. They're each overly polarizing modes of thought. And even if, as we talked about last week, in our everyday lives, we flip back and forth between them and apply them to different parts of our life, that's still not sufficient. It means that in no part of our life are we actually being wise. We're just shifting between two sort of extremist modes in various flavors and combinations. What Hegel says is that what you're looking for in the resolution of the struggle between them is a synthesis that creates a third way, a new direction, a new path, a new mode of thought that he calls Vernunft. And if we were using Kenneth Smith's terminology, Kenneth Smith never mentions Vernunft. He read it, he gets it, but he expresses it as, it is like a gnosis form of noesis. It's like a begriff form of Verstand, where we have taken what we've learned from having been intellectualized, I mean, making ourselves artificial and abstract and deliberate, but we recombine it with, we re-immerse it and tether it to the gnosic experience of the world, so that we stop flying off on these crazy abstractions that lead us to do wars and holocausts, and we start being connected to what are the things that we could do that actually are healthy and sustainable and lead to wisdom. This is a very different conception of the relationship between these modes of thought than we see in Zhou Dunyi's writing here within the Taiji Tushuo. And that's not surprising, because Taiji Tushuo was written 1,000 years ago. Okay, 900 years ago, whatever. But this is, ideas evolve over time. So if we were to, for example, attempt to say that because Zhou Dunyi is writing about yin and yang, he must mean it the way that we mean Hegelian dialectics, we would be misrepresenting him. We'd be doing a Verstand thing. We'd be putting him on the Procrustean bed and making him fit our preconceptions instead of seeing him as the philosopher he actually was, saying the things he was actually saying. And what was revolutionary about him from Chinese philosophical perspective is that, previously the Confucians and the Taoists were competing for followers. And what he's doing here, which is so radical, is he's incorporating yin and yang more directly and more firmly into Confucianism than it ever had before. He's creating a child of Taoism and Confucianism and saying, this is going to be Neo-Confucianism going forward. And even though he had not that much effect in his own lifetime, that's actually what happened when later people rediscovered him and then said, that's the way. That's what we're going to do. We're going to meld these things. So his goals were different than our goals. And the things he was trying to say were different than the things we're trying to say. They're related. Anybody can see, as thoughtful people, we can see the relationship between this schema and the Hegelian schema. But there's no question that this is a perfect example of what Kenneth Smith talks about when he says that the way we learn about perspectives has to not be that we torture them to fit our current perspective. It has to be that we hold them separate as an other in their own right and express them in their own terms and learn how the world looks from their perspective instead of trying to make them just some appendix to our own perspective. Because once we do that, then we can hop back and forth between them. We could start to, if we really got comfortable with Zhou Dunyi's Taiji Tushuo, his perspective on yin and yang and how they relate to each other, we could get to a point where we could turn that back around and look at Hegel and say, well, if Zhou Dunyi was commenting on Hegel, what would he have to say about him? Which is something we can't do as long as we warp, Zhou Dunyi's perspective to make it seem like Hegelianism. That's the power that Kenneth Smith wants us to learn how to acquire. to get these guys to be able to comment on each other, and of course then be able to turn them all on us. Say, well, what do they think about us? What do they think about our world? You know, that polyperspectivalism. So I wanted to stress this point about this representation of yin and yang, that it was so early in the process of creating a diagram, but there had already been discussion of yin and yang for over 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years by this point. It just had never been codified to this extent in writing. Before I turn back to the main discussion, I think Zhou Dunyi is worth people's time, because not only did he write the Taiji Tushuo, which is so important historically as just like this is like 1066 in the Norman invasion of England. This is a major turning point in the history of Chinese philosophy, that we first get somebody making a diagram and trying to describe the cosmology as a whole directly in its own terms. So that's awesome. But he didn't stop there. He also tried to develop an ethical system of 5 moral principles and explain how people ought to live in the world. I'm an ethicist. I care a great deal about justice and ethics. So I'm fascinated. I want to read his Tong Shu, which is the book he wrote about ethics. And the fact that back then people used to write really short books. It's like, I have no excuse not to read both of these books. They're going to be potent and they're going to be short, right? That's a combination I can't resist. So why don't we turn here to comments for a while before I take us to the next step in yin and yang, and we'll see who's got their hands up. Sharon, was that you? She says, no, it wasn't me. Oh, are you on mute? You're on mute.
I just want to make a quick comment. Where he first started out writing the definition of yin and yang, he says in the beginning, and then he goes on to talk about yin and yang, which is male and female. It sounds like Genesis.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's a cosmology. There's no question.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the second point I wanted to make is I'm interested in how the yin and yang underscores the mythology, and the mythology really dictated the way of life, because in 1400 and 1500, when the rest of Europe was colonizing the world, Africa, I think it's 1421 is the name of the book. 1421, the Chinese discovered America feasibly before Columbus did.
Yes.
But they had no interest in the conquest.
Yes.
So my question here is this philosophy underscored the behavior.
Yes. Yes. Boy, is that a good point, Sharon. My first exposure to any serious Chinese history came during my college years, not because of I going to college, but my future wife was going to Pacific Lutheran University, and they had a great history program. She ended up getting a history minor, and she took a whole course on Chinese history, which is more than I've ever done. I've only ever picked it up piecemeal, which is not nearly good enough. And she was the first one to tell me, I had never realized this, that I don't remember what Chinese emperor it was, built like the greatest fleet of its era or that the world had ever seen. Just amazingly huge ships with equipped to levels that we wouldn't have thought possible in the Middle Ages. They're just basically whole traveling farms and zoos and armies and so on. And they traveled around the world. We know they did. They documented the whole thing. They went to Africa, they went to India, and everywhere they went, they told everybody, we're pleased to meet you. By the way, our guy's the emperor. He's in charge of everything. Carry on as you were. And they didn't conquer them. They just wrote about them and learned about them, and then they went home. And the reason they went home is they thought they were already home. They didn't need the rest of the world. What was the point of that? That China's where they wanted to be. And what would be the point of conquering everybody? That would be stupid. But of course, sadly, we then followed along with our example of running around the world conquering everything. And
I think they're also the first ones that made ammunition, gunpowder, and guns.
Gunpowder, yes, but not ammunition.
Oh, gunpowder. Okay, good.
For fireworks,
I was about
right?
to say I don't recall that very well.
Yeah. They did fireworks and explosives, I think, but not guns necessarily. Richard, you had your hand up. You want to go?
Yeah,
ahead?
I'd like to throw in kind of a contrarian thing though before we kind of romanticize,
oh, I know,
Chinese cultures too much.
Good.
It was also like us has many periods of tremendous violence, as well as subjugation and colonializing neighboring countries, like say like Korea, like Vietnam has a long history of kind of being made as a tributary state to China. That they did not, decide to colonialize North America, possibly may have just been a logistical challenge. I don't know, but yeah.
So let's underscore that a little bit. Chinese history, just incredibly brutal for long periods of time. They had periods of stability. They also had periods of just gross brutality. I want to call people's attention to a beautiful and powerful and well-written but deeply problematic film called Hero that came out a few decades ago. It adopts the story
Rashomon structure, right? Like
yes,
told through different eyes. Yeah,
like Rashomon, it tells the same story multiple times, but you do not get bored because every time it tells it, it uses different cinematography, a different color scheme, and it also rewrites the history that you thought you just learned in provocative ways that make you go, "Oh my God, really?" Like literally every time they retell the story, you end up rocking back, going, "Oh my God, really?" So it's engaging and involving. I say it's problematic. There's a couple things about it. One is it definitely depicts the violence of the era in which China was trying to unite. There are scenes of armies firing thousands of arrows at calligraphy schools and murdering the calligraphers. It's just like you watch it and you're just like, this is a crime against humanity, right? But those moments are set from the perspective of people they're trying to defend the calligraphers, standing on the roof, using their superior martial arts to try to stop the arrows and let the people finish the amazing, works of literature that they're trying to document. It's this potent, moving, almost mythical kind of thing that's going on. The upshot of the film, I won't give away the plot, but the upshot of the film, which concerns a lot of people, is it seems to suggest, in the strongest possible terms, that all that violence was okay because it led to unification, and unification led to peace.
Well, I'm not showing up in the video, so.
No, I see that.
So I wonder, I mean, it's also dangerous to over-romanticize the Chinese culture because there was a lot of yang.
Yes.
In other words, China was really a very diverse with many separate countries.
Yes.
And so it wasn't a matter of just unification. It was a matter of conquest.
It was.
So like, this year, not this year, but last year, the Chinese government declared for the first time, I think, since the Ming Dynasty, the next golden age of China. And which is sort of interesting because, in other words, they're going back to the fact that it's going to be an expanded culture. So in some sense, I wonder whether the whole argument about the underlying philosophy doesn't have a lot to do with just a natural unfolding and development of history and civilization. Because, traditionally, when you live in tribes, there was you, in a sense, against nature, living in nature. But once you develop a civilization, it seems to me, naturally, it had to, at least in the beginning stages, develop a hierarchy, develop a separation of labor and so forth, and then once you develop that, you begin to exploit the hierarchy, right? And so yes. In the same sense, in India, you have the caste system, because what that separation naturally developed, in a sense that, you have to have this sort of like division so you could get, in the sense, to a greater efficiency and understanding. So that maybe is mixed up with the development of philosophy, but it really drove the fact that that's how society developed. Now, we might reach the point where we're beginning to understand that we have to take care of the environment, right? But before, it was really, it was, first of all, in some sense, a man against nature, in the early sense, because you have to survive in it. But it began to develop a thing which you have to be very yang oriented because it began to be society against society. So you have to develop a structure to, in a sense, exploit your power. And now we understand that we exceeded that because we could actually destroy each other at infinitum. So maybe it's time to move back to a balance. But I think you could also see this as just a natural unfolding of the development of civilization, you know, and in some sense you can't say, well, it would have been better if we never became civilized. Yeah, in some sense maybe that's true, but it kind of almost had to be, because, you know, as human population grow, you begin to develop understanding of territories and the whole bit, and it's like.
So I'm going to call on Marianne in a moment. Thank you for that, Phil. But before I do, there's a point in what you said that was one of the points I most wanted to make about where we're at in the discussion. And that is that it is impossible to separate these philosophers from the politics of their time, or from the threads of politics that continue to the present in some cases. So in the case of the film Hero, it's attempting to justify all the violence that happened by saying, well, at least we unified. That was funded by the Chinese government because they were attempting to justify the political repression that was happening just before the time that the film was made. And so they make this film that says it's okay if rebels and, you know, people of high moral standing, you know, have to be trampled on the way to unification because, you know, that's what's required for us to live a life of peace. The film does not make it. It is unambiguous about this point. It's the whole point of the ending of the film. However, when I say it's problematic, I sort of mean that in a complicated way, because if you actually, after you watch that and have your moment of shock going, oh my God, are you justifying Tiananmen Square? If you actually go back and rewatch the film carefully, you may reach the conclusion that even though that's the moral of the story and it had to be obvious so that the government would fund it, that everything else about the film seems to be saying the opposite. Because all the people who fought against the centralized government were the most noble, they were the most ethical, they cared the most about other people, they were trying to do wonderful things, and they were just being trampled by this, you know, rush to empire. And the structure of the story actually is giving the opposite message of the moral of the story. It's like those Victorian versions of Aesop's fables, where here you get Aesop's fable, and then some Victorian comes along and just slaps on some moral, and the moral might not be what Aesop meant at all. It's what the Victorian is attempting to make it mean while he's teaching kids to be good and not fidget in class and so forth. So this film has this kind of quality to it that it might have two different levels of politics going on in it. That it might be, on the one hand, endorsing, you know, doing whatever it takes to unify or to conquer the people, but on the other, it might be subverting it.
But this seems like a story of America. I mean, like, you know, like unification, manifest destiny, you know, like, well, we have to do this to the American Indians because we have to unify the country, do we not? And so they stood in the way. But if you really think about it, certainly in a moral sense, some of the Indians, at least some of them, were much more noble than we were, you know, like, so in other words, it didn't only happen in China, it happened in America.
Right. Colonizer culture versus indigenous culture is a pattern we've been struggling with worldwide. And Europe is not the only center of colonizer culture. China, there is no doubt, was doing the same thing. I've got more to say on this, but first, Mariana, I don't want to keep you waiting.
Yes. So I wanted to talk about Genghis Khan and then,
please,
you know, the 1200s.
Yes.
He did dominate, and he was very interesting because he was brought up in more of a natural kind of religious kind of thing where the mountains had spirits and things like that. And he didn't take the religions away from the people that he dominated. He allowed the people to have their own religion. And there was a lot more religious freedom in the time that he dominated this whole empire. And I think part of what our discussion is that I think we have to evolve beyond allowing sociopaths to become the dominant force creating our society.
Yes, wouldn't that be nice? This is where the discussion of, you know, empathy versus conflict and self versus other really comes into play. Is It's very easy to erase your boundaries and be all one together when all the people you're trying to be one with want to do the same thing. But if some of them are exploitative parasites who want to dominate everybody else and take everything they have, the worst thing you can do is unlock all your doors and open your windows and remove all your defenses and say, have your way, because then they say, okay, I will. And, that's how you get genocides. That's how you end up erasing languages and cultures and peoples is by the inability to set boundaries against that sort of exploitation. So it's a point well taken, Marianne. When we look at these Chinese philosophers, part of what we're going to see is there are. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just briefly,
please.
That's why there is no native tribe of Seattle. They've been fighting to get recognition by the federal government, but they are too integrated. So Seattle, the Duwamish tribe, was too welcoming.
Yes.
Apropos of what you were just saying.
Yes. Let me underscore that for those who don't know the story.
Anyway.
Because Anna's point is right on the money. Seattle's literally named after Chief Seattle of the Duwamish. It was the local indigenous people. And he made a deal with the European colonizers. And the deal was, I'll let you have the land to make Seattle. And in return, you give us a reservation and the following fishing rights and so forth. And everybody said, yep. And they wrote it up and they signed it and it was a treaty. And then we never did. Like never. They are, to this day, not only do they not have a reservation, they are not a federally recognized tribe. The city of Seattle would not exist without the Duwamish playing nice with us. The way that it does today, I mean, they were as nice as they could possibly be. And we did the worst thing we could possibly do in return, which is like, you don't exist. You're nothing. So there is a movement called, Real Rent Duwamish for those who live in Seattle or in the area, where you can arrange to give a little bit of your paycheck every month. It doesn't have to be a lot, but a little bit of your paycheck every month goes to the Duwamish tribe so that they can build language centers so they don't lose their language and, try to reclaim some land so people have some place to live. Homelessness among the Duwamish is huge because this is their land and we didn't give them anything else other than that. Phil, you got your hand up.
Yeah, this goes back to Genghis Khan. I mean, like, it's not necessarily exhibition of being magnanimous that he allowed these religions to survive, different cultures survive. It's also practicality, because Alexander the Great did the same thing, because he realized he was more interested in conquering more. It would just take too much time and effort to have an occupation army everywhere. So part of it just sort of practical, let them be until at least you're strong enough. Like even Rome was more magnanimous than we were, so
well, it's we've talked in past weeks about that partially it's the difference between polytheism and monotheism. The polytheistic perspective assumes that we live in a complicated world and that therefore the deities are complicated and we don't know them all. So it's not our business to tell other people that their deities don't exist. They could be right. We might need to add their deities to our collection so that we can be more like them a little bit and see the things that they see. That's how the Greeks treated it. That's how the Romans treated it. That's how Genghis Khan treated it. They all had this notion that there is diversity in nature and there needs to be diversity in the way we understand the sacred. Monotheism tends to take the opposite attitude, that there's only one right way. And since every other way is wrong, it should be stamped out. And so genocides and totalitarianism are a normal accompaniment of monotheism, even when the monotheistic deity tells you to love one another. The irony that we can't seem to resolve is, how can you have a founder who says love one another and then have followers who are doing, the Inquisition or doing the Crusades? And the answer is, it's in the structure of monotheism itself. If everybody's wrong, then you have to stop them, right? Isn't that, regardless of whether your guy told you not to do that, you can sort of see it from the structure of the belief system. So Jyoti, you got your hand up. But you're on mute. You got to come off mute.
Rick, I was hoping to hear more about what you had learned from the original Chinese texts about yin and yang.
Okay. So
I do a quick point to add on to Phil, and then we can return back to the yin and yang topic.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Richard, after I call on Richard, I'll do that.
Or I was going to say, to add on to Phil's point about practicality of just not, dealing with, taking down, certain religions, of your conquested people. I would say like, or even further to that, like, and I don't know whether that was a dynamic that happened during Genghis Khan's reign, but I can kind of like think of other kind of situations of, but you can't like, like often, like churches and societies, form kind of, either an informal or formal power structure in the society, and then as a conqueror, often you can instead like collaborate with them to help you impose your order. I mean, like, sort of one of the most recent, like, examples of this, like is, like the Catholic Church, and the Nazis, and like, but like it's sort of like, okay, like I started mentioning that's going to kind of like evoke, but I think just sort of like yeah, they're sort of like, I think like, it's sort of like, like the British kind of had this down to, this is maybe going a little bit of tangent, like, but like the British in their empire, they would often, like leverage existing social hierarchies and fractures in society to basically like the British always involve some element of the people there to enforce their order in their empire, and which often led to, when their empire, or when the empires withdrew, then, like that led to, retribution, like,
yes.
Yeah, as those many decades or how long of power and inequality, gets retribution pays out.
Right. Old grudges, now that there's not a force keeping us from going at each other, emerge, and suddenly we start doing that. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the things we learned. So one of the things I want to talk about is that it's interesting that so much of our yin and yang theory comes not from the Taoists or from other philosophical traditions, at least not directly. It comes from them indirectly, but directly it comes from these Neo-Confucians who are attempting to expand Confucianism and make it more appealing. I want to give you an example of that that isn't directly about yin and yang, but really illustrates the seriousness of what the Neo-Confucians were trying to do then. And that's Moism. How many of you know about Mo Tzu? We've heard of Lao Tzu, we've heard of Kongzi, Confucius, we've heard of Mentzi, Mencius. Most people haven't heard of Mo Tzu or his Moism, which is ironic because during the height of Moism, Confucianism was a minority religion. They'd lost enormous numbers of people to Moism. It and Taoism were the dominant religions for a while in China. No question, hands down. Confucianism wasn't even close. Neo-Confucianism was a reply to that, and an attempt to make Confucianism more acceptable and to lure people away from those. So let me tell you just for a little bit about Mo Tzu, and you might find yourself wanting to read up on him after this. Mo Tzu had a lot in common with Jesus. Confucius was saying that we should focus our empathy and our respect on our family, especially our elders, and on the structures of society, especially our kings and lords. And the goal was for Confucianism to reinforce the social structure. And that was why it spread early on. It was obviously appealing to emperors because, reinforce my social structure. I'm all about that. They did what they could to spread it, and it caught on. But the problem was that these lords who were doing that also each wanted to be the emperor of the United China, so they're all fighting each other all the time. So relentlessly picking fights. They're doing this in the way that 1,000 years later, the Europeans would be doing the exact same thing. Everybody wanted to be the Holy Roman Emperor, wanted to be the new Rome, so in Europe, everybody's fighting each other later on. Chinese got that out of the way much earlier. They went through that period where they were just at each other's throats. And they were all Confucianists. They were all following the same theory of, they were just disagreeing about who's at the top of the chart. You should all organize your society around me and my rulership and show filial piety and all of that. So Moism arose as a response to that. And it said, you know what? That's deeply immoral. Love and respect should not be reserved for existing power structures. You should have love and respect for everybody. All the stuff you think about from Jesus, Mo Tzu said that stuff first. He talks about how, yes, you should respect your parents and you should take care of your family, but if it stops there, then you're an immoral person. You need to go out into the world and find other people and take care of them too. You need to reach out and have a bigger heart than that. And the Confucianists and the Mohists had enormous arguments about this, especially where the Confucianists then lied about Mohism and said, oh, they don't think you should take care of your family at all. They think you should only take care of strangers. They tried to pull that off and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is people were fed up with these stupid dueling warlords. They're like, yeah, what if we stop fighting each other and we actually take care of each other? So that stuff is interesting because a lot of that we associate with Jesus, who comes out with it later, or Rabbi Hillel. But it doesn't end there. Mohism was hilarious for another reason. Turns out Mo-Tzu was really good at fortifications and engineering. I mean, he was brilliant. Like, he could take a town with a rough palisade and turn it into an impenetrable fortress and train everybody how do you repel an invading army. And he ran around to all the places where the news was out that some lord was about to invade that place. And he'd whip them into shape and get their army put together and get their walls put together and responses to siege engines. And then he would go to the lord who was about to invade the area and he'd lay out for them, I'm going to show you all the things I've taught them how to do. This is the new wall they have. Here's the moat. Here's the things they have for burning your siege engines. Here's the techniques they'll use. And these will all work and you'll be defeated. And he managed to get warlords to give up and go home multiple times over and over and over throughout his life. Let me tell you, the Confucianists hated this stuff. Right? It's like you're interfering with the rightful order of things. You're making the people supreme over the rulers. People who are supposed to be victims are now, repelling their would-be assailants. And that's no good. I mean, he infuriated the established order. So you could see why this belief system would catch on, right? What's the perfect adjunct to love your neighbor? The perfect adjunct is, if your neighbor's a jerk, I'll teach you how to defend yourself against him. You can love him from behind walls. You don't have to be a victim. You can love without being preyed upon. You can love without being a victim. Mohism, that's why it became the dominant religion alongside Taoism for a long time. So the Confucians had a problem. Confucianism was dwindling. It was becoming a smaller and smaller religion. The people were flocking to Taoism and Mohism. And that's why they overhauled Confucianism and they said, well, okay, maybe you shouldn't only love your parents and the hierarchy. Maybe you should have some love for your neighbors too. Right? They softened their position about the hierarchy and started to allow some of that to happen. And as a result, a lot of people left Mohism and went back to Confucianism because it had the old pedigree, right? And also because the lords would reward you for being Confucians. They're like, you're a good peasant. You're doing what you're supposed to do. Whereas they didn't look too kindly upon people being Mohists because that had a sort of anti-authoritarian flavor. So you guys might want to look up Mo-Tzu. Not everything he said, makes sense from modern terms, but there's a lot of stuff he said that you'll look at and go, wow, I had no idea that this was an enormous movement in China for a while. So this was the same time that the Neo-Confucianists are importing Taoism and starting to draw diagrams of how the Tao works, yin and yang, and what's their relationship to each other. It was part of a process of trying to rehabilitate hierarchical philosophies in a way that made them more acceptable to people who had previously had valid criticisms against it.
Do we know when the first tadpole drawing made its debut?
Yes, it's shockingly late. Shockingly late. Let me pull up the link. I get here too. We have a fairly decent article on this from Wikipedia. Some of the subjects I'm interested in, I absolutely can't use Wikipedia as a reference because they're awful. But some of the references are just right on the money. So there, right? This is the emergence of the tadpole and the history of it. And it doesn't really get started as a tadpole until I guess the Ming era. It starts to emerge. Zhao Huiqian, 1351 to 1395 was the first to do a version of the swimming tadpole. And in the 18th century, we have people copying those texts and augmenting them. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again because here's an example of one. Right?
Could I ask?
Go ahead.
Hi, Rick. I'm just curious. Is anybody in the meeting whose family was of Confucianism in their family? I'm just curious. Turns out my father was a Confucius.
Was he, Ginny?
Yeah. I just found out recently. I have a rather interesting life. And I got separated from my family when I was 11, 12. And then I rediscovered them when I was in college. And then now, as I was writing my memoir, I started digging around more and more about my family and found out that even though my mother and one of my aunt was the founder of One Buddhism in South Korea, my father was a Confucius. Would you say Confucius or was into Confucianism?
He was a Confucian.
I guess, yeah. So anyway, I was just curious if anybody else's family was
my mother's family is actually quite interesting. They're part of a clan system that was pervasive in southern China. And the clan system came to an end under communist China, but it was allowed to exist in Hong Kong, which is where my family is from. And so the original founder of the Tang clan traces like 27, 28 generations back to the sister of the emperor at the time, who then settled in the new territories in Hong Kong and founded the clan. Yeah. So there's some interesting history and conflicts and kind of Game of Thrones backstabbing stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I don't have that name because I'm on the mother's side, and so definitely in terms of that patriarchy, it's very much so. Like I am the other. I am the foreign, like the other family, like out. Yeah. So.
Rick, yeah, Phil, go ahead.
Rick, could you answer a question that I'm curious about the yin yang symbol?
Well, I could try.
I was always curious why it was not in any national symbols of China, but it was the national symbol of Korea.
Yes.
So that was mysterious to me.
Yes.
Okay, you partially explained it, but I want you to make it a little bit more concrete. It's like, was that because like Korea really didn't have that much interaction with China until the Neo-Confucian period, and so what they have is really Neo-Confucianism rather than the original Confucianism, and a Neo-Confucianism is probably one that may have projected this yin-yang symbol or something. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, the history of the Korean flag, it's definitely more recent than that period. They definitely got it from China, but the problem is, as with Taoism, it doesn't therefore follow that it's strictly Confucian. So for example, the Taoists adopted the yin-yang symbol later. Once it had been developed, they're like, yeah, that's what we've been saying for thousands of years. We just didn't have a picture of it. And so, you know, to do justice to your question, I need to learn more about Korea than I know right now. I will say about Korea that it is an under-examined culture around the world. You know, most of the countries that are on the periphery of China are under-examined. They have deeper histories. They have their own philosophical traditions. And in the case of Korea, it's particularly important because I don't know how many people know that Korean is a language isolate. There's no other language in the world related to Korean. Nobody knows where it came from. And its racist.
Well, you know, I'm South Korean, so
yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I started out my life as a South Korean. In fact, all of a sudden, I did not write or read Korean for years and years and years. So all of a sudden, all these Korean songs I sang as a child is coming back to me in Korean. Yes. So I'm writing them down in Korean, not perfect, you know, but I'm still writing in Korean. And it's very strange how all that Korean was just sitting in the back of my brain somewhere, and all of a sudden it's resurfacing.
Yes.
But Korean, when you really listen to them speak Korean, the sound of Korean language is more similar to Japanese than Chinese. But it's interesting that you know more about Korea in some respects than I do.
Oh, I only know so little.
Yeah, yeah, but I know I really don't know much about Korea because I came to America at a very young age. And yet the reading and writing has stayed with me, even though I would not be able to carry on a conversation with Koreans. That's another thing I find very interesting about your brain, human brain, is that certain information just stays with you, and yet other information is gone.
Yes.
And I don't know how, yeah, I find very strange, right? I
It
can
is
read
weird.
Korean and yet I don't know what I'm reading.
Yes.
You know, that kind of thing, you know.
Jenny, did you know that under hypnosis, if people are susceptible to hypnosis, they can pull any phone number you've ever known in your life out of your memory, that you
Really?
somehow never forget that, even
It's
though
just
you're
filed away.
Yeah.
I like to think of the last scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, the gigantic warehouse, crates upon crates upon crates vanishing into the distance. And that's the human brain. Like nobody goes back there in the dusty areas. But you're right. I mean, Dave, it's just shocking sometimes under hypnosis. People will pull out things that they haven't thought about in decades. They just didn't even know it was there. Richard, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'll add kind of at least what I know, my 2 cents about kind of neighboring countries around China. It was kind of an interesting revelation to me, you know, a number of years ago when I found out from some friends, you know, who I would describe that, you know, they've been to the US a while, but they're also kind of steeped in Chinese culture, but then also I think, you know, similar to our discussion group, they kind of have a revulsion to the modernity that we're seeing. But so they tell me it's like, if you want to kind of more closely experience traditional Chinese values, and, you know, Confucian and Taoist ideals, it is better to experience that in Korea or Taiwan than it is in China on average.
Right.
Oh, wait a minute, Richard. I find that very interesting what you just said, because I look at Korea as it is now with these K-pop and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And I see these faces, Korean faces, and I hear that there's more plastic surgery going on in Korea than any other country in the world. And I think I look at these faces that has been plastic surgery, then blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking,
don't get me wrong. I'm not saying South Korean society is a conservative society. There's been dramatic change and, you know, and conflict and in the 20th century. But I mean, just in terms of at least, you know, compared to say modern China, like at least the viewpoint of this person is that, you know, more has been allowed to persist, you know, like evolving, you know, in a society, but like of traditional, you know, what I thought was traditional Chinese values, Confucian and those ideals in Korean society than say in Chinese society. I mean, I think like, you know, the Cultural Revolution was very, very destructive to the social cohesion, you know, the society, because you basically had, you know, like all these like, you know, vendettas being taken out on each other, where you could report your neighbors to like, you know, secret police and stuff like that, and people would just be disappeared and stuff. It's like, it was extremely, you know, devastating. You know, I mean, like, you know, like, don't get me wrong. I have a little bit of knowledge, at least of you know, read the recent century or so of, you know, like of Korea, you know, having been, you know, like a place of conflict, you know, between different powers. But I mean, like, you know, the Cultural Revolution, at least, you know, from this person's point of view, you know, like who, I think, you know, even though he didn't live through the Cultural Revolution, was obviously traumatized by it, you know, like that was his viewpoint.
Yeah. But you know, I personally, when I think of the pictures and what's going on in Korea, and I keep saying to myself, where is the Korea that I knew?
Yeah.
Right.
And so for me, it's a culture shock of what's going on in South Korea. So,
you know, I draw our attention to Korea in part for a reason. I'm going to share my screen and just, I want people to just reflect for a second on this picture. It's a map. Now here's Korea, right? The Korean peninsula. There's Japan. To the west we have China, and to the north we have, you know, Siberia. And what's fascinating is how in none of these other languages are language isolates. How does Korea get to be a language isolate? Most people traveled from somewhere to somewhere else, and they didn't all go together in one mass. They left people along the way. You know, there were divisions in the populations. And so you could see generations of languages spreading over time. Language isolates are unusual when they're like this. There is a hypothesis that there's a reason why Korean left no evidence anywhere else. And the hypothesis goes that it's an indigenous language. But that the Koreans didn't all live where they do now, where they used to live, is here in the water. And we look at this and we think, well, there's above water and underwater. Nobody can live underwater. But 10,000 years ago, this was all above water. If you look at geologists' maps of the Ice Age, what you'll find is that there are places in the world where the coast didn't change very much with the melting of the ice. And there's other places where it changed dramatically. And that's because there's long shallows now under the water. And in those places, if you think about where human settlement patterns happen, people like to settle along coasts. They like to settle in lowland valleys that are fertile, that are good places for hunting animals or for developing agriculture. And all those lowland areas would have been right in here, in this place that's now underwater. And so there's reason to think that the Korean language is actually really, really, really old. It's a descendant of very old languages, and that there used to be Proto-Korean people living in this area, and that's why we don't find evidence of the ancestors of the Koreans anywhere else, because they've been there such a long time.
The story goes that my family did come through from Mongolia, and they worked themselves through down from Mongolia down to South Korea. That's what I was told when I was growing up.
Sure.
So,
yeah, there would have been waves of people moving into Korea for sure. It's not like they had a wall around them or anything, but kind of the core of the language, the core of the culture, may be a lot older than we think it is. And as a result, I'll call on in just a second, Phil. As a result, what that means is that it would be well worth studying the oldest forms of Korean philosophy that we could find to try to get some insight into, how different were they before all the Chinese influences kind of began to wash over them. What were Korean philosophies before all the Chinese was imported? Like, we don't know the full origins of yin and yang and Taoism. I'm going to talk about Lao Tzu in just a moment, but we know that it's older than Lao Tzu. This concise Chinese history book that I shared with you in the links and recommended you guys pick up. It's one of the first things he says about Taoism is most people think that it started with Lao Tzu, but it did not. There were people doing Taoism before Lao Tzu. We know some of their names and what they said. And so it goes way back. We don't know exactly how back. So maybe the reason that China later adopts the yin and yang symbol on their flag is because they were doing yin and yang, philosophy and cosmology for a long time.
Did you say China or Korean adopted the yin and yang symbol in their
why Korea put it on the flag later after China invented it might be because not that they're importing a belief system, but that, like the Taoists, they looked at it and said, that's a nice picture of the thing we've been believing for thousands of years. We don't know. We're not sure yet. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, when I was teaching in Youngstown, I had a colleague who was Korean, and I asked him this question, like Koreans seem to be different from Chinese and Japanese. And I said, what is your origin, right? And he said, you're most closely related to Mongolians. And I never checked that, but that was placed with my understanding of Chinese history to a certain degree. In the 11th century, Mongolia conquered China, right? It was part of the Yuan dynasty.
Yeah.
And then when the Ming dynasty rebelled and threw them out, apparently there was trouble. No, actually the other way around. When the Yuan dynasty, there was always a problem for the Mongols to justify that they belong in the lineage of the
I remember this.
Okay. And so it took them a long time to resolve that. And what finally the historian resolved that was that there was another civilization that was sort of bordering China, or sort of like near Korea, but sort of bordering China, so somewhere near Manchuria or something, in which apparently through marriage of some kind, it was in China, and so they justified it. But unfortunately, of course, by the time they justify it, the Ming dynasty have overthrown the Yuan dynasty, so they didn't need that.
Too late.
But that bit of information might be added to the fact that, in fact, there was already some kind of Mongol blood in this other dynasty. So maybe that there is a relationship between the Mongols
Yeah.
and the Koreans.
Yeah, there could be. You know, their languages are dramatically different, but they could be genetically related. Ginny, go ahead.
This is going off slightly. Genghis Khan, which area, what country was Genghis Khan originally from? I mean, where was he born? Does anybody know?
Oh, it was Mongolia.
It was Mongolia. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I read some trivia somewhere at one point that he and his sons, grandsons, or whatever, they have procreated more human beings on this planet than any other family in the world throughout history. Because has anybody else read that trivia?
Yes.
For all we know, we
Khan.
all may be related to Genghis Khan.
Yes.
Genetically.
Yes, he had a lot of children, all over 2 continents. Yes. Yes, he did. So in our last couple of minutes here, you know, obviously yin and yang, Daiji, all of these things are Chinese philosophy as a whole. These subjects are too big to do justice to in 3 hours. But what I do want to do in the last 5 minutes here is raise some of the issues that Mahbub has been talking about in the chats, which I saw the first time he posted it, but we were on another topic and I filed it away saying, oh, we are definitely going to talk about that, Mahbub. There's just no question. So what is the relationship between Hegelian dialectics and the Heraclitean notion of transformation on the one hand and yin and yang on the other? Are they actually related ideas and not just similar or convergent? So there's a couple of things to know about this. The first thing we have to start with is that the old orthodoxy that people didn't used to travel more than 30 years from their home has been disproven. There are people who didn't travel more than 30 miles from their home. Sorry, miles, not years. But we now have just archaeological proof that there were trade networks that spanned continents. We find things in the British Isles, you know, in the BCE era before the Romans came that predate the Romans, that came from China, that came from Korea, that came from Japan. I mean, people were trading across vast distances. That means some people were traveling. And if people are traveling, they're talking, especially if they're doing trade. And if they're talking and they're trading, then they're communicating. So you can't have a massive religious phenomenon like Taoism or Moism or Confucianism going on in China and pretend that there's a big wall and none of it would seep out. That's just implausible. And it's also implausible that if it seeped out, it would only go 30 miles. These ideas will have spread. They had to spread because people were spreading and they were talking. If you're passionate about, suppose you've discovered the dialectic, right? You're a Chinese monk and you are all over the dialectic and you look around the world and go, man, if everybody would adopt these ideas, it would change everything. And you talk to a trader and you get him excited about it. And now he's on fire about the dialectic. And now he travels the Silk Road. Can we really believe that across his entire life and all his decades, he never once mentions the idea he's most passionate about? It's implausible. And these ideas, they catch fire because they're so exciting. They spread. So here's what we know. We know that Taoism and the concepts of yin and yang are older than Lao Tzu. You'll see that in this concise book of Chinese history that I recommended. We know that Lao Tzu was writing about the same time Heraclitus was writing in Greece, in Ephesus on Asia Minor. And Heraclitus is postulating these ideas of transformation, the interpenetration of opposites, the importance of paradox to the cosmos, all these same ideas that we see later described more carefully by the Neo-Confucians are we know they're nevertheless present in these earlier works. And we know that, that Heraclitus is saying many of the same things. He got his belief system largely out of the Eleusinian mysteries. These are the mysteries of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, right? And we know that the Eleusinian mysteries had to do with cycles of life and death over time, and the way the grain rises up and its seed, the culmination of the seed, reseeds the soil. And so the soil, which we associate as the non-living part, and the plant that's living part are actually involved with each other in a paradoxical give and take kind of relationship. So he was saturated in this stuff. We also know that Ephesus was the richest city in the world at that time. This is why in the New Testament, they're constantly talking about the worldliness of the Ephesians. and how they're interested they are in money and gold because they had so much of it. During the Roman era, it was the second most important port in the Roman Empire, which means it was a crossroads of empires. People are passing. The Silk Road is going to Ephesus. There is no question. It was the major cosmopolitan city on that coast of Asia. So to explore this idea, people have been writing books, comparing and contrasting and seeing if they could trace the threads that lead back and forth between the Tai Chi Tao ideas in China and the emergence of Heracliteanism among the ancient Greeks. And there is, I'm just going to share a couple of quick books. The one guy, Ruhi Afnan, believes that the link was Zoroastrianism in Persia. He thinks that Zoroastrianism is wherever the ideas started, that was the crossroads. And he can demonstrate powerful links between the Greeks and the Zoroastrians, documented links between the two traditions, showing at least that part of the transmission could have occurred. So he wrote this, and he also wrote, Zoroaster's influence on Greek thought. Both of these books are available used. They're not collector's editions, so their prices haven't jacked up like a lot of other books have. You can find them if you want to. Then also M.L. West wrote this book, comparing and contrasting Chinese philosophy with archaic Greek philosophy and tracing the threads. Now, in the modern era, we are used to people just postulating ideas that have no basis in fact. But these guys are serious writers, and they're really looking at the evidence. It's at this point, even though we can't prove that there was philosophical exchange at that early state between China and the archaic Greeks, it's actually getting increasingly difficult to maintain the argument that there wasn't. It would have been so easy, it would have been so inevitable, and too many things line up. Okay, so yeah, let me put the name of the first book in there. It's a long title, so I'll just type it in here. The first one is Zoroaster's influence on Anaxagoras, if I can spell Anaxagoras, the Greek tragedians, and Socrates. And this is by, it's an H, right? Ruhi Afnan. Ruhi Afnan. And the second one is Zoroaster's influence on Greek thought. I'll type that in too, by the same guy. We know the Greeks were influenced by the Egyptians. We know they were influenced by the Mesopotamians. We know they studied extensively. We know many Greek intellectuals actually traveled to Mesopotamia and Egypt and studied under them and brought home ideas about astronomy, cosmology, mathematics. A lot of the things that we credit as Greek discoveries in our naive version of European history, we can prove were actually developed in those other places and transmitted to them. So we know that much of Africa and Asia was a powerful influence on the Greeks. We know the Greeks were voraciously curious because of the nature of their polytheism. They thought everybody else had thoughts and insights that they didn't have, and they needed to find out what they were. It's part of why when Alexander the Great took his army to India, there was a massive exchange of ideas. He didn't just want to go there and impose anything. He wanted to find out what they knew and bring it back home. And in the Alexandrian era, there's a massive influx of philosophy and ideas and writings, which is why they had to set up the Library of Alexandria. They needed a place to start collating these massive collections of ideas. But the evidence increasingly seems to be that there was exchange earlier than that. And there's no reason to think that somebody wasn't talking to somebody. There might be some relationship between these two. And the reason that's important is, as Hegel says as directly as he possibly can in Lectures on the History of Philosophy, his volume 2 on Greek philosophy, he talks about Heraclitus. And he says, there's not one proposition of Heraclitus's that hasn't become some centerpiece of my philosophy. So Hegelianism is Heracliteanism as brought up to date and expressed in German, and with influences from Kant and so forth. And if Heracliteanism is in some way a synthesis of archaic Greek philosophy and these archaic Chinese philosophies that predate Lao Tzu, then there's a continuity of tradition. So even though the exact form in which we find yin and yang and the Taiji at various periods in Taoism or various periods of Confucianism might not be exactly the same, because after all, we're talking thousands of years of intellectual development in different directions. It may actually be that this metaphor that Kenneth Smith is trying to draw here is more appropriate than it might seem on the surface. And that's where I wanted to bring today's discussion.
And do you, Rick, do you also, if you, as you said, that Greeks were influenced by Egyptians, do you also agree that Romans were influenced by Greeks?
Yeah, and the influence was massive because the Romans were practical. They were engineers, they were warriors, they were builders, they were farmers. They thought that it was dangerous or disgusting or weakening to spend too much time thinking. And so for their philosophy, it's either Cicero or I forget which guy opens his major philosophical work by apologizing for writing a work on philosophy. He says he promises to try to keep it practical because you know how dangerous it is to dither around with intellectual stuff. It was considered unmanly. So their response to that was, they needed to know things, so they hired slaves. Right? Greek intellectuals were enslaved and brought over to Rome to give them ideas. And so a lot of the Roman cosmology and philosophy is Greek Roman philosophy and cosmology, just in a sort of enslaved form.
So if Zoroastrianism is the linchpin,
yeah,
how did it came about? I mean, it came about in Persia, so it didn't spring up by itself. So how did it collect, and why in Persia instead of like somewhere else? I mean, Persia was a very big country. It was an empire at that time. I understand.
Yes, massive. And Zoroastrianism is so old, we don't actually know when it started.
Yeah.
It's older than Persia. It's in Persia, but it's in the predecessors to Persia, as well as continuity to today. So it's like Hinduism. It's a very, very old religious system. It makes sense that if anything had been there long enough to be a link across time as well as space, it would be right there in the center of the Silk Road between China and the Greeks. And of course, our problem is we've lost so many of the histories and writings that could have told us, who talked to whom and who were the, intermediate philosophers along the way who developed these ideas. We don't have those handy. Part of the reason that I made so going back to Mythic Desperation to wrap up today's discussion, these essays by Kenneth Smith mostly didn't have subdivisions. I mostly put the little headers in. It's one of the things that I did to prep this book as I went through and studied his lines of argument and figured out where the breaking points, because it's just too hard if we can't reference a section number to say what we're reading, where we are. So as part of that process, when I set aside the yin and yang section, I knew it was short, but I felt like it was potent and it was going to take a lot of discussion to really do justice to it. So I have an ulterior motive. I have a secret plan that I'm gonna share with you. My plan for this series is that although this series is primarily about using Kenneth Smith's writings to explore not only his philosophy but all the many philosophers that he brings into bear, that he touches on, like he talks about Hegel and talks about Nietzsche. So it's a great way to learn about Hegel and Nietzsche because Kenneth's trying to do justice to them. So he's constantly relating them to each other. But that all of the people that he has worked in are just a subset of the total world of philosophy. Right? There is a long-term criticism against European philosophers that we ignore Asia, we ignore Africa, we ignore indigenous American philosophies, we ignore Aboriginal Australian philosophies. We have this very Europe first, Europe last, Europe is the be all and end all, which we sort of inherited from the 19th century theory of Europe and the straight white intellectual man as the pinnacle of evolution. Well, we want to get out from under that. And if we're going to get out from under that, then we have to take Kenneth Smith's ideas, which are about adopting other philosophies and holding them side by side in our brain and letting them speak in their own authentic voices. We need to extend that beyond Europe. We need to let Zhou Dunyi speak in his authentic voice, right? Zhu Shu needs to speak in his authentic voice. Zoroaster. We need all these people to be brought into the conversation. And my plan for the seminar series is to gradually bring in the Hindu, the Arabic, and the Chinese, and the African, and the Indigenous American, and to show how they relate to each other, and to try to get ourselves a more cosmopolitan view. So, ooh, look what you got. What is that, Anna? Tell us about that. Come off mute.
It's just a nice yin yang that my son made. I like it.
I like the use of the waves.
Like a wave going across the moon?
Yes, reminds me of Hokusai.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Cool, huh?
So anyway, if you guys are up for that, that's kind of, you know, my ulterior plan underneath the text of what we're talking about over the months ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, Rick, if you and Trevor Noah got together, what kind of conversations you guys would have. I'm a big fan of Trevor Noah also. And I don't know, somehow I think you guys could get along really well. You need to try and meet him.
I would love to meet Trevor Noah. There's so many great people to meet. Yeah. For Christmas, my wife got me a book, maybe the book that surveys Native American philosophy. It quotes from, you know, Vine Deloria and countless others, Anna Walters, and I'm looking forward to reading it and you know, having conversations, as it were, with all these other philosophers, and trying to to transcend the European-centric nature of the philosophy I've been immersed in my life. And where I luck out is because I was so immersed in karate when I was little, and it was an old traditional style of karate. So it made me love Zen and Taoism, and, you know, really want to learn more. But finally, belatedly now in my 50s, I can.
Was it Gojo Ryu that you studied?
No, it was the other really traditional one, Shorin Ryu. I have Goju Ryu friends, but I don't know it.
So are we going in taking this approach? In other words, a kind of almost world approach.
Yes.
But it seems to me another approach would be to go through Plato and dig into pre-Socratic philosophy, and then from that expand out and say this is where it came from. But is it because there's so little original text of the pre-Socratics that you have to go in this direction rather than expanding out? You're kind of emerging in.
Yes. And it's a problem, because when we look at the archaic Greek philosophers, we find them just powerfully penetrating and evocative, and yet we have so little from them. It's like, clearly they were talking about the big issues in potent ways, but, you know, the medieval monks didn't feel like preserving it. So we only have fragments. But, you know, Hegel made his whole philosophy out of Heraclitus, and that was a pre-Socratic. So there's material here to mine. So,
I mean, is there, this sounds curious, but is there kind of a curious history in the sense that we have so little, therefore it's much more open to possible interpretation? In other words, the mystery remains because there is so little, in a way. It's a funny paradox.
It is a funny paradox, right? It's Kenneth Smith has an unusual position about Heraclitus. Most people say that most of Heraclitus's book was lost, and that all we have are these fragments. And Kenneth says, well, that could be true. Certainly every other person who talks about Heraclitus will tell you that that's what happened. But we don't actually know if there was much more than what we have. It could be that he wrote in fragments, because some of the dominant forms of philosophy that we know about that predated Heraclitus were about trying to write the most pithy, gnomic, condensed sentences possible. So like noesis auton dates from that period. There was this movement to try to collect these short aphorisms of the most powerful, potent philosophical stuff that could possibly be expressed from all over Greece. And they put them up on pillars in various places in where the Greeks traveled. For example, Alexander the Great's army erected one of those pillars near India, and it's got all these little wisdom sayings on it. So the fact that Heraclitus wrote in these tiny little wisdom fragments, it might be that that was their original form. And although we might not have all of them, that might have been the point, is just, you know, take these ideas and then you do the work of combining them with each other and see what they mean to each other and how they change each other. And that's what makes you a philosopher instead of just a consumer of somebody else's ideas. It might have been deliberate.
Yeah.
Which is a completely different model than the later Apollonian, Platonic, I'm going to explicate at length and tell you all the details and try to get you to believe all the things exactly the way I believe them. So there's a huge shift from the archaic Dionysian approach to philosophy and the later sort of intellectualized literalist philosophy.
Well, it's closer to poetry in a way, right? I mean, the man so much missing parts. I mean, and it's supposed to be missing, right? Otherwise, you can't enter into it. It's just like,
you can't step in the same river twice. I mean, that's poetry, man.
Yeah.
And with that, let's wrap up for today, and we'll pick this up next week with the next section.
Hey, thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank you, Rick and
thank you, David.
Yes.
And I know you have another meeting tonight on Kant, right, David?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure wish you were doing it a little bit earlier. 9 o'clock is awfully late for me. But I'm going to try and pop in for 5 minutes.
9 o'clock in Seattle?
Oh, well, I'm 9 o'clock in Austin, Texas.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but it was a wonderful session today. Thank you again.
Yeah. I mean,
Thank you.
I look forward to Mondays now.
Yay. Me too. You guys are great.
Thanks.
All right. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.